Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The fuel gauge needle had been sitting just above the red quarter mark for the last 40 minutes, and Thaddeus Rook kept glancing at it every time the Peterbilt's engine coughed on an uphill grade. He was hauling a flatbed load of industrial steel coils, 22 tons of raw stock destined for a fabrication plant outside Altoona, and the route his dispatcher had sent him was supposed to shave 90 minutes off the usual I-76 corridor. The GPS had taken him off the main turnpike an hour ago, threading him through a patchwork of state routes that grew narrower and more cracked with every mile. The sun had dropped behind the ridgeline 20 minutes back, and now the only light came from his high beams cutting through the dense tunnel of bare oak and pine that pressed in on both sides of the two-lane blacktop. He'd passed exactly 3 other vehicles since the exit: a rusted-out pickup, a minivan with a taillight out, and a state DOT truck parked at a closed-way station with no one inside. The CB radio had been silent for over an hour, except for occasional bursts of static that sounded almost like voices, but dissolved before he could make out words. Thaddeus reached for the laminated fuel card clipped to his visor and did the math again in his head. He'd topped off in Breezewood, which should have given him enough to make Altoona with a comfortable margin, but the detour had added miles he hadn't accounted for, and the grades were steeper than the map suggested. The dispatcher, a woman named Jolene, who had a habit of booking him on routes that looked good on paper but turned into nightmares on the road, had assured him there was a truck stop at the junction of Route 36 and some county road whose number he couldn't remember now. He hadn't seen a single fuel sign in the last 30 miles. The forest here was old-growth dense, the kind that swallowed sound and made even the rumble of his diesel engine feel muffled and small. He checked the odometer, another 12 miles to the junction, assuming Jolene's information was even current. The fuel gauge dipped another hairline toward red. He eased off the throttle and kept his speed at 52, watching the road for any sign of civilization. A barn light, a farmhouse porch lamp, anything, but there was only darkness and the endless flicker of tree trunks in his headlights. Then the road curved sharply to the left, and the trees opened up, and Thaddeus saw the overpass. It was a massive concrete structure, 4 lanes wide, stretching across a narrow valley and disappearing into the hills on the far side. But the strange thing was that the road beneath it, the road he was on, didn't continue under the overpass. Instead, it dead-ended at a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and a faded yellow sign that read, "Road closed, no through traffic." He slowed the Peterbilt to a crawl and pulled onto the gravel shoulder, letting the engine idle while he stared at the fence. Beyond it, he could see the old roadbed continuing into the darkness, cracked and overgrown, but still intact. The overpass above was dark and silent, no traffic lights or reflectors, and he realized with a strange jolt that it wasn't an active highway at all. It was abandoned. He'd heard about this place. Every trucker who ran routes through central Pennsylvania had heard the stories about the old turnpike, a stretch of highway that had been decommissioned in the 60s when the state built a new alignment to bypass the mountains. 13 miles of crumbling asphalt and 2 massive tunnels left to rot because it was cheaper to abandon them than to maintain them. He'd never thought he'd actually see it, let alone be sitting at its entrance with a quarter tank of fuel and no other options in sight. Thaddeus picked up the CB handset and keyed the mic. "Breaker 19, this is northbound Peterbilt at the old turnpike junction. Looking for fuel advice. Anybody out there?" Static hissed back at him, long and empty. He tried again, adjusting the squelch knob and scanning through the channels, but got nothing except distant fragments of conversation that faded in and out too quickly to follow. He set the handset down and pulled out his phone. No signal. The screen showed a single bar that flickered and died as he watched. He tried pulling up the GPS app anyway, but the map wouldn't load, just a spinning blue circle over a blank gray screen. He was offline, out of range, and running out of fuel in a place that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The smart thing to do would be to turn around and backtrack to the last town, but that was at least 20 miles behind him, and the fuel gauge said he didn't have 20 miles left. The only other option was to keep going forward on the active road and hope he hit a gas station before the tank ran dry. But the GPS had shown nothing ahead for another 30 miles, and he didn't trust Jolene's intel anymore. He looked at the chain-link fence again. It was old and sagging, the posts leaning at angles, and there was a gap near the left side where someone had peeled back the mesh and wired it loosely in place. Fresh tire tracks led through the gap, not truck tracks but car or van-sized, and continued onto the old roadbed beyond. Someone had been using this route recently, which meant it was passable, or at least passable enough for smaller vehicles. Thaddeus chewed the inside of his cheek and thought it through. If the old turnpike ran 13 miles through the mountains and came out somewhere on the other side, there was a chance, slim but real, that there might be an access road or a maintenance depot where he could find fuel or at least a phone signal to call for help. It was a gamble, but staying here wasn't an option, and backtracking might leave him stranded in the middle of nowhere. He shifted the Peterbilt into gear and eased forward, angling toward the gap in the fence. The chain link scraped along the side of the trailer with a metallic shriek that made him wince, but then he was through and rolling onto the old roadbed. The pavement cracked and buckled, but still solid enough to hold the weight. The road ahead was darker than anything he'd driven through before. The trees closed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out even the faint starlight, and the road surface was littered with leaves and broken branches and chunks of concrete that had spalled off the edges. His headlights picked out the faded yellow center line and the rusted guardrails that lined the curves, and every so often he'd pass a milepost marker, the numbers weathered and illegible. The engine sounded louder here, echoing off the trees in a way that made him feel like he was driving through a tunnel, even though he was still in open air. He kept his speed at 30 and watched the fuel gauge, which was now sitting just above the red line, the needle trembling with every bump. The CB radio crackled again, a burst of static that almost sounded like words. Pull over, stop. But it cut out before he could respond. He grabbed the handset anyway and tried calling back, but got only silence. After 2 miles, the road began to descend into a valley, the grade steep enough that he had to downshift and let the engine brake do the work. The trees thinned out, and he could see the shape of the land opening up ahead, a wide bowl of darkness with a single structure rising out of it, the entrance to the first tunnel. Thaddeus had seen pictures of the old turnpike tunnels online, grainy photos taken by urban explorers and ghost hunters, but seeing it in person was different. The tunnel mouth was a massive arch of cut stone, 40 feet high and just as wide, with the roadway disappearing into a black void that his headlights couldn't penetrate. The walls were streaked with rust stains and water damage, and the pavement in front of the entrance was buckled and heaved where tree roots had pushed up through the cracks. There was a rusted sign bolted to the rock face above the arch. Rays Hill Tunnel, Caution. The word caution had been spray-painted over with blocky red letters that spelled closed. He brought the Peterbilt to a stop about 50 feet from the entrance and sat there with the engine idling, staring into the darkness. Every instinct told him not to go in. Tunnels were dangerous under the best circumstances, restricted airflow, poor visibility, no room to maneuver if something went wrong, and this one had been abandoned for over 60 years. There could be structural damage, cave-ins, flooded sections, or worse, but the fuel gauge was now touching the red line, and he could feel the engine starting to stumble. That subtle hesitation in the throttle response that meant the tank was pulling vapor. If he turned back now, he'd be stranded on the side of the road with no fuel and no way to call for help. If he went forward, there was at least a chance he'd make it through to the other side and find a way out. He reached up and flipped on every exterior light the truck had. Headlights, fog lamps, clearance markers, even the strobes, and then shifted into low gear and rolled forward into the tunnel. The transition from twilight to absolute darkness was instant and disorienting. The tunnel walls swallowed the light from his headlights, reflecting it back in weird angles that made it hard to judge distance or depth. The roadway inside was even worse than outside, pitted with potholes and covered in debris, chunks of concrete, rusted metal scraps, broken bottles, and piles of leaves that had blown in and rotted into black mulch. The air smelled like damp stone and diesel exhaust and something else, something organic and sour that he couldn't place. The tunnel ceiling was barely high enough to clear the top of his trailer, and he could hear the metal scraping against loose sections of rebar that hung down from the cracked concrete above. He kept his speed at 15 miles per hour and focused on keeping the truck centered in the lane, but the darkness was so complete that he felt like he was driving blind, navigating by instinct, and the faint echo of the engine off the walls. Halfway through, the headlights picked out something on the road ahead. A vehicle. Thaddeus eased off the throttle and brought the Peterbilt to a crawl, his heart rate spiking. It was a van, white and windowless, parked at an angle across the lane with the rear doors open. The paint was faded and streaked with rust, and the tires were flat, but it didn't look old enough to have been sitting here for decades. He stopped the truck about 30 feet back and left the engine running, the headlights illuminating the van in harsh white light. There were no markings on the side, no company logos or license plates, and the interior of the cargo area was empty, except for a few wooden pallets and what looked like oil stains on the floor. He picked up the CB handset and tried again. Breaker 19, this is northbound Peterbilt inside Rays Hill Tunnel. If anyone's monitoring, I've got a vehicle blocking the lane. Over. Nothing but static. He considered backing out, but the tunnel was too narrow to turn around, and reversing a flatbed trailer through a mile of darkness wasn't something he wanted to attempt. The van was close enough to the right wall that he might be able to squeeze past it if he angled carefully. He shifted into gear and started forward, edging to the left and watching the clearance between his trailer and the van. The gap was tight, maybe 18 inches, but he thought he could make it. Then, as he was halfway past, the CB radio erupted in a burst of static, and a voice came through, loud and distorted. "Stop! Don't move! They're watching!" Thaddeus slammed on the brakes and the Peterbilt lurched to a halt, the trailer rocking on its suspension. He grabbed the handset and keyed the mic. "Who is this? Who's watching?" The static hissed for a few seconds, then the voice came back, clearer this time. "You're in the tunnel. You need to get out, now." The transmission cut off. He sat there with the engine idling, his hands gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles ached. The voice had sounded male, middle-aged, with an urgency that wasn't faked. But who was it? And how did they know he was in the tunnel? He glanced at the rearview mirrors, but the darkness behind him was absolute. No headlights or movement. He looked forward again, past the van, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. Tire tracks in the dust and debris on the tunnel floor, leading away from the van and deeper into the tunnel. They were fresh, made within the last day or two, and they were from multiple vehicles, cars, vans, maybe even another truck. Someone had been using this tunnel recently, and not just passing through. He thought about the gap in the fence, the tire tracks on the old roadbed, and the van with no plates. This wasn't random. This was organized. The fuel gauge was below the red line now, the needle buried in the empty zone, and the engine was starting to cough. Thaddeus made a decision. He couldn't sit here and wait for whatever was going on to come find him, and he couldn't turn back. He had to keep moving and hope he reached the far end before the tank ran dry. He shifted into gear and started forward, squeezing past the van with inches to spare. The trailer scraped against the tunnel wall with a metallic screech that echoed through the darkness, and then he was past and rolling deeper into the mountain. The headlights picked out more debris as he went. More pallets, a rusted barrel, a tarp covering something he didn't want to look at too closely. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the walls pressing in on all sides, and then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint gray light ahead. The exit. He accelerated, the engine sputtering and coughing, and then he was out, bursting into open air with the night sky above and the road ahead curving away into the darkness. He didn't stop. He kept driving, the fuel gauge reading empty, the engine running on fumes and momentum, and after another half-mile he saw lights ahead. A cluster of buildings set back from the road, surrounded by a gravel lot and a chain-link fence. It looked like an old maintenance depot, long abandoned, but with a few lights still on inside one of the structures. He pulled into the lot and brought the Peterbilt to a stop near the fence, the engine finally dying with a wheeze and a shudder. He sat there in the sudden silence, his hands shaking, and stared at the building. The lights inside flickered once, then steadied. Someone was in there. The maintenance depot looked like it had been built in the 50s and left to decay ever since. Thaddeus sat in the dark cab of the Peterbilt, watching the single illuminated window on the second floor of the main building, trying to decide if walking toward that light was the smartest or stupidest thing he could do right now. The building itself was a 2-story concrete block structure with a flat roof and narrow windows, most of them boarded up or covered with steel mesh. The gravel lot around it was littered with rusted equipment, old road graders, a fuel truck with no wheels, stacks of concrete barriers overgrown with weeds. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, but the gate was hanging open on one hinge, and the no trespassing signs were so faded they were barely legible. The light in the window flickered again, and Thaddeus saw a shadow move across it. A person, definitely a person, walking past the glass. His phone still had no signal, and the CB radio was dead now that the truck's battery wasn't charging it. He was stranded, out of fuel, in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help except to walk up to that building and hope whoever was inside wasn't the same people who'd been using the tunnel. He grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket and his tire iron from under the seat, then climbed down from the cab. The night air was cold and still, carrying the smell of wet leaves and old diesel. He left the truck unlocked. If someone wanted to steal a flatbed with no fuel and 22 tons of steel coils, they were welcome to it, and started walking toward the building. His boots crunched on the gravel, loud in the silence, and he kept the flashlight pointed at the ground to avoid announcing his arrival too obviously. As he got closer, he could see that the building's ground floor was mostly garage bays. The roll-up doors rusted shut or blocked with wooden pallets. The entrance was a steel door on the side, propped open with a cinder block, and a faint glow of light spilled out from inside. He paused at the threshold and called out, "Hello? Anyone here? I need help." His voice echoed off the concrete walls inside. No response. He stepped through the doorway into a long hallway lined with empty offices and storage rooms, the floors covered in dust and broken glass. At the far end, a metal staircase led up to the second floor where the light was coming from. Thaddeus started up the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The tire iron held loosely at his side. The second-floor hallway was better maintained than the ground level. The dust wasn't as thick, and there were recent footprints in the grime on the floor, multiple sets leading in and out of the rooms. He followed them to the lit room at the end of the hall and stopped in the doorway. It was an office, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with a metal desk pushed against one wall and a pair of filing cabinets in the corner. A camping lantern sat on the desk, casting harsh white light across stacks of paper and what looked like ledgers or logbooks. The walls were covered in maps, road maps, topographical surveys, blueprints of the tunnel system, with routes marked in colored pen and post-it notes scribbled with dates and numbers. But the room was empty. Whoever had been here was gone now, and they'd left in a hurry. One of the desk drawers was half open, papers spilling out onto the floor, and a coffee mug was still steaming next to the lantern. He walked to the desk and looked at the papers. They were manifests, shipping documents listing cargo types, weights, pickup and delivery locations. Most of them were for standard freight, machine parts, raw materials, palletized goods. But several had handwritten notes in the margins. No way, back route only, cash on delivery. The dates ranged from 6 months ago to last week. Thaddeus picked up one of the ledgers and flipped through it. Each page was divided into columns: date, vehicle type, cargo description, entry time, exit time. The entries went back years, hundreds of them, all using the abandoned turnpike as a route. He set the ledger down and looked at the maps on the wall. Someone had marked every access point to the old highway, every gap in the fences, every side road that connected to it. The tunnels were highlighted in red, with notes about clearance heights and weight limits and blind spots, where line of sight was blocked. This wasn't just casual trespassing. This was a logistics operation, organized and deliberate, using the abandoned turnpike as an off-grid corridor to move cargo without inspection or documentation. A sound from downstairs made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the metal staircase. Thaddeus turned toward the door and gripped the tire iron tighter. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. Then a voice called out, deep and measured, "You're not supposed to be here." Thaddeus stayed where he was and called back, "Neither are you, I'm guessing." The footsteps resumed, coming down the hallway, and then a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall and lean, maybe 60, with a weathered face and close-cropped gray hair. He wore a dark canvas jacket with a patch on the shoulder that read Pennsylvania State Police, but the uniform underneath looked old and faded, like it hadn't been regulation in decades. His hand rested on the grip of a flashlight clipped to his belt, but he wasn't holding it like a weapon. He looked at Thaddeus, then at the tire iron, then at the papers on the desk. His expression didn't change. "You ran out of fuel," he said. It wasn't a question. Thaddeus nodded. "Came through the tunnel, saw the lights here." The man stepped into the room and looked at the maps on the wall, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't have come through the tunnel." "Didn't have much choice," Thaddeus said. "I'm hauling a load to Altoona, and my dispatcher sent me on a route that doesn't have any fuel stops. The old turnpike was the only way through." The man turned to look at him, his eyes sharp. "Your dispatcher sent you here? What's her name?" Thaddeus hesitated, then said, "Jolene. Works out of a brokerage in Harrisburg." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tension. "She sent a lot of drivers this way?" "I don't know," Thaddeus said. "This is the first time I've been routed through here. Why?" The man didn't answer. He walked to the desk and started gathering up the papers, stuffing them into a leather satchel that had been sitting on the floor. "You need to leave," he said. "Get your truck out of this lot and back onto an active road. There's a state route 3 miles north that'll take you to a fuel station." "My truck's out of fuel," Thaddeus said. "I can't drive 3 feet, let alone 3 miles." The man stopped packing and looked at him. "Then you need to call a tow." "No signal out here," Thaddeus said, holding up his phone. "And my CB's dead, that's why I came looking for help." The man stared at him for a long moment, then pulled a sat phone from his jacket pocket and handed it over. "Call a tow. Tell them you're at the old Breezewood Maintenance Depot, North Access. They'll know where that is." Thaddeus took the phone and looked at it. It was a heavy brick of a device, military grade, with a short antenna and a keypad that looked like it belonged in the 80s. "Who are you?" he asked. The man zipped up the satchel and slung it over his shoulder. "Someone who's trying to clean up a mess that should have been dealt with 30 years ago. Make the call and get out of here. Don't come back." He walked out of the room before Thaddeus could ask anything else. Thaddeus stood there for a moment, listening to the footsteps recede down the hallway and fade into silence. Then he looked at the sat phone and dialed the number for the towing service his company contracted with. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. "Pike's Recovery and Transport." Thaddeus gave her his location and explained the situation. Out of fuel, stranded at the old depot, hauling a flatbed load that needed to get to Altoona. The woman on the phone was silent for a few seconds, then said, "You're at the Breezewood Depot? North Access?" "That's what I was told," Thaddeus said. "How soon can you get someone out here?" Another pause. "We've got a unit about 40 minutes out. Driver's name is Minna Lockridge. She'll bring fuel and get you moving." "Appreciate it," Thaddeus said, and ended the call. He set the sat phone on the desk and looked around the room one last time. The maps, the ledgers, the manifests. Everything pointed to a smuggling operation, or something close to it. Cargo moving through the old turnpike without inspection, without way stations, without any official record. And that man, whoever he was, knew about it. Was trying to shut it down, maybe, or document it. Or something else entirely. Thaddeus picked up the sat phone and walked back downstairs, out into the cold night air. The gravel lot was empty now, no sign of the man or his vehicle, if he'd even had one. The Peterbilt sat where he'd left it, dark and silent. The flatbed load still chained down tight. He climbed into the cab and locked the doors, then settled in to wait for the tow truck. His hands were still shaking, and his mind kept replaying the warning he'd heard on the CB inside the tunnel. They're watching. Who was watching? The people running the smuggling operation. The man at the depot. Someone else entirely. He pulled out his own phone and tried again to get a signal, but still nothing. The screen showed 11:47 p.m., less than 2 hours since he'd entered the old turnpike, but it felt like days. He leaned back in the seat and closed his eyes, listening to the silence outside. 40 minutes later, headlights swept across the lot, and a tow truck pulled in. A big, red, Peterbilt wrecker with a fuel tank mounted on the flatbed. The driver climbed out. A woman in her 50s, compact and wiry, with short gray hair and grease-stained coveralls. She walked up to Thaddeus's door and knocked on the window. He unlocked it and she pulled it open. "You the one who called for fuel?" she asked. Her voice was rough, like she'd spent half her life breathing diesel fumes. Thaddeus nodded. "That's me. Thanks for coming out." She looked past him at the empty gauge on the dash, then at the flatbed load behind the cab. "You're lucky you didn't run dry inside the tunnel," she said. "That's a hell of a place to get stuck." "I almost did," Thaddeus said. "Saw some things in there I'm not sure I was supposed to see." The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked toward the depot building, then back to him. "Best not to talk about it," she said. "This area's got a lot of history, and not all of it's the kind you want to dig into." She went back to the wrecker and started unspooling a fuel hose. Thaddeus climbed down and helped her connect it to the Peterbilt's tank. The pump hummed to life, and diesel started flowing. "How long have you been running tows out here?" he asked. "Long enough," she said. "You're not the first driver to run out of fuel on the old turnpike, and you won't be the last. The guy at the depot said my dispatcher might have sent me here on purpose," Thaddeus said. "That make any sense to you?" The woman looked at him, her face unreadable in the harsh light from the wrecker's work lamps. Depends on who your dispatcher works for, she said. Some brokerage firms have arrangements with certain carriers, routes that don't show up on the official logs, loads that need to move quiet. You're saying my company's involved in this? Thaddeus asked. She shrugged. I'm saying there's a lot of freight moving through these mountains that nobody wants to talk about. If your dispatcher sent you through the old turnpike, either she didn't know what she was doing, or she knew exactly what she was doing. The fuel pump clicked off, and she disconnected the hose. Thaddeus paid her with his company card, and she handed him a receipt. You want my advice? She said. Get your load delivered and don't ask questions. Whatever you saw in that tunnel, forget about it. The people running this operation don't like loose ends. She climbed back into the wrecker and drove off, leaving Thaddeus alone in the lot again. He got back in the Peterbilt and started the engine, checking the gauges. Full tank, oil pressure good, no warning lights. He shifted into gear and pulled out of the lot, following the dirt access road that curved away from the depot and reconnected with the old turnpike a quarter-mile north. The road ahead was dark and empty, but he could see the glow of highway lights in the distance, the active state route, civilization, safety. He accelerated, putting the tunnel and the depot and everything he'd seen behind him. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere in the darkness behind him, someone was taking note of his license plate, his truck number, his route, and that whoever they were, they'd be waiting for him the next time his dispatcher sent him through these mountains. Thaddeus made it to Altoona by dawn and dropped the steel coils at the fabrication plant without incident. The receiving clerk barely looked at him, just scanned the bill of lading and signed off on the delivery, and Thaddeus was back on the highway within 30 minutes. He should have felt relieved. The load was delivered, the truck was running fine, and he had a full tank of fuel, but instead he felt wound tight, like something was about to snap. Every mile marker he passed, every overpass he drove under, he found himself checking the mirrors for vehicles that might be following him. The CB radio stayed silent except for the usual chatter from other drivers talking about traffic and weather, but he kept the volume low and didn't join the conversations. He didn't want to draw attention. When he reached the truck stop outside Harrisburg, where his company kept a small dispatch office, he parked in the back lot and sat in the cab for 10 minutes, watching the other trucks come and go, looking for anything out of place. The dispatch office was a double-wide trailer at the edge of the lot, wedged between a Subway franchise and a diesel repair shop. Thaddeus climbed the wooden steps and pushed through the door into a cramped room that smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke. Jolene was sitting at her desk, typing on a keyboard that looked like it dated back to the 90s, her eyes fixed on the monitor in front of her. She was in her 40s, heavy-set, with frizzy blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and a Bluetooth earpiece permanently attached to her head. She didn't look up when he walked in. "You're early," she said. "I didn't have you clocked in until noon." Thaddeus walked to the desk and set his logbook down in front of her. "We need to talk about the route you sent me on." Jolene glanced at the logbook, then back at the monitor. "What about it? You made the delivery, didn't you?" "Yeah, I made it," Thaddeus said. "But not before I ran out of fuel and had to go through the old turnpike. The abandoned one, with the tunnels." Jolene stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then she slowly turned to look at him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. "The abandoned turnpike," she repeated. "You mean the stretch near Breezewood?" "That's the one," Thaddeus said. "The route you gave me had no fuel stops for over 60 miles. I ran dry and had to detour through a decommissioned highway that's been closed since the 60s. And while I was in there, I found some things that make me think you knew exactly what you were doing when you sent me that way." Jolene leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. What kind of things? Thaddeus pulled out his phone and opened the photo app. Before leaving the depot, he'd taken pictures of the maps and manifests in the office. Not many, just enough to document what he'd seen. He held the phone up so Jolene could see the screen. Shipping manifests for cargo moving through the old turnpike without way station checks. Routes marked on maps showing every access point. Logs going back years with vehicle types and entry times. This is an organized operation, and someone at this company is part of it. Jolene stared at the phone for a long moment, then stood up and walked to the door. She locked it and pulled down the blinds on the windows, then came back to the desk. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, more controlled. "You shouldn't have those pictures," she said. "And you definitely shouldn't have gone into that depot." "I didn't have a choice," Thaddeus said. "I was out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. What was I supposed to do, sit on the side of the road and wait for someone to find me?" Jolene rubbed her face with both hands, then sat back down. "Listen to me very carefully," she said. "That route I sent you on was a mistake. I pulled it from an old database that hadn't been updated in years, and I didn't check the fuel stops before I dispatched you. That's on me. But the stuff you saw in that tunnel, the manifests, the maps, that's not something you want to get involved in, trust me." "Too late for that," Thaddeus said. "I'm already involved. I drove through the tunnel. I saw the van with no plates. I talked to a guy at the depot who had a state police patch on his jacket, but didn't seem like he was working in any official capacity. And then I got a fuel delivery from a tow operator who told me to forget everything I'd seen because the people running this operation don't like loose ends." Jolene closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. When she opened them again, she looked older, more tired. "The guy with the state police patch, did he give you a name?" "No," Thaddeus said. "But the tow operator's name was Minna Lockridge. She works for Pike's Recovery and Transport." Jolene's jaw tightened at the name. "Pike," she muttered. Of course it was Pike. "You know him?" Thaddeus asked. "I know of him," Jolene said. "Algernon Pike. Used to be a state trooper assigned to the Turnpike Patrol back in the 80s and 90s. He was the one who first documented the smuggling activity on the old highway after it was decommissioned. Spent years trying to get the state to shut it down, but there were too many people with too much money invested in keeping it open. Eventually, he retired, or was forced out, depending on who you ask, and started working independent investigations. If you ran into him at that depot, it means he's still trying to build a case." Thaddeus sat down in the plastic chair across from Jolene's desk. His legs felt unsteady, like the ground had shifted under him. "So this is real," he said. "The smuggling operation. It's actually happening." "Has been for decades," Jolene said. "The old turnpike's been used as an off-grid route since the day it was closed. No way stations, no patrol, no surveillance. Perfect for moving cargo that doesn't want to be documented. Drugs, stolen goods, black market electronics, anything that needs to get from point A to point B without a paper trail. The people running it have connections in law enforcement, in state government, in freight companies like ours. They pay well, and they don't tolerate mistakes. And you're part of it," Thaddeus said. It wasn't a question. Jolene looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Not by choice," she said. 3 years ago, I got behind on my mortgage after my divorce. One of the company executives offered to cover my payments if I'd help route certain loads through certain areas. I didn't ask questions, I just updated the dispatch software and sent drivers where I was told to send them. I didn't know about the tunnels until later. And now you're sending drivers through there on purpose," Thaddeus said. "Not on purpose," Jolene snapped. "That route I gave you was a genuine mistake. But yes, there are loads that go through the old turnpike. Usually it's drivers who've been vetted, who know what they're hauling and where it's going. You weren't supposed to be one of them. Thaddeus thought about the manifest he'd seen, the notes scribbled in the margins. No Wikawe back route only, cash on delivery. He thought about the van in the tunnel, the tire tracks leading deeper into the mountain, the voice on the CB warning him to stop. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you delete those pictures and forget everything you saw," Jolene said. "You take your next load and you drive your route, and you don't mention the old turnpike to anyone. Not to other drivers, not to the police, not to Pike if you see him again. Because if the people running this operation find out you're talking, they will make sure you stop talking, permanently." Thaddeus stood up and looked at the door. He could walk out right now, report everything to the state police, hand over the pictures and let them deal with it. But Jolene was right. If the operation had connections in law enforcement, there was no guarantee his report would go anywhere except back to the people he was trying to expose. And even if it did reach someone clean, there was no way to protect himself while the investigation played out. He'd be a target, and targets didn't last long in this business. He looked back at Jolene. "I'm not deleting the pictures," he said. "But I'm not going to the cops either, not yet. I need more information first. I need to understand how deep this goes and who's really running it." Jolene shook her head. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Thaddeus said. "But I'm making it with my eyes open. If you hear anything at all, about who's organizing the routes or where the cargo's coming from, you let me know. Otherwise, stay out of my way." He unlocked the door and walked out, leaving Jolene sitting at her desk with her head in her hands. Outside, the truck stop was busy with mid-morning traffic, drivers fueling up and heading out for their next runs. Thaddeus walked back to his Peterbilt and climbed into the cab, then pulled out his phone and looked at the pictures again. The maps, the manifests, the logs, all of it was evidence, but evidence of what exactly? A smuggling ring using abandoned infrastructure to move illegal cargo. But who was supplying the cargo? Who was coordinating the routes? And what would happen if he pushed hard enough to find out? He started the engine and checked his dispatch app for his next load. Pittsburgh to Buffalo, a straightforward run on the interstate with plenty of fuel stops and way stations. Normal, safe, exactly the kind of route he needed right now. But as he pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto the highway, he couldn't stop thinking about the tunnel and the depot, and the man with the state police patch who'd told him to leave and never come back. 3 days later, Thaddeus was parked at a rest area outside Eerie, eating a sandwich in the cab and scrolling through his phone, when a knock on the door startled him. He looked up to see a man standing on the step outside. Tall, lean, gray hair, dark canvas jacket. Algernon Pike. Thaddeus unlocked the door and Pike climbed in, settling into the passenger seat without asking permission. He looked older in daylight, the lines on his face deeper, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You didn't delete the pictures," Pike said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" Thaddeus asked. "Because if you'd deleted them, you wouldn't still be asking questions," Pike said. "And you've been asking questions. I heard about your conversation with Jolene. Heard you've been poking around online, looking for information on the old turnpike. That's dangerous, Rook." "Not as dangerous as staying quiet," Thaddeus said. "If this operation's as big as you say it is, someone needs to do something about it." Pike smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I've been trying to do something about it for 30 years, he said. "You know what I've got to show for it? A stack of reports that nobody reads, a pension I had to fight for, and a target on my back that's never going away. The people running this operation have more money and more connections than you can imagine. They own judges, prosecutors, police chiefs. They own freight companies and logistics firms and trucking unions. You think you can take them down with a few pictures on your phone? I think I can make enough noise that someone has to pay attention, Thaddeus said. If I go public with this, leak it to the media, post it online, someone will investigate. Even if the state won't do it, the federal government might, the FBI, the DOT, somebody. Pike shook his head. You go public, you'll be dead within a week. These people don't play games. They've killed drivers before, made it look like accidents, brake failures, jackknifed trailers, vehicles that went off the road in the middle of the night. You want to end up as another statistic? Thaddeus set his sandwich down and looked at Pike. Then what do you suggest I do? Just forget about it and keep driving? Pretend I didn't see anything? No, Pike said. I suggest you work with me. I've been building a case for years, documenting every load that goes through the tunnels, tracking the vehicles, identifying the routes. What I don't have is someone on the inside, someone who can get access to the dispatch records, the cargo manifests, the financial transactions. You're in a position to get that information. Jolene trusts you, or at least she did before you confronted her. If you play this smart, you can feed me the data I need to finally shut this operation down. Thaddeus thought about it. He thought about the van in the tunnel, the maps in the depot, the warning from Minna Lockridge. He thought about the loads he'd hauled over the years, the routes he'd driven, and how many of them might have been part of this network without him even knowing. What do you need from me? He asked. Pike pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it over. It was a list of names and companies, freight brokers, logistics firms, trucking contractors. Some of them Thaddeus recognized. These are the players, Pike said. The ones I know about, anyway. If you can get access to your company's dispatch records for the last 5 years, routes, cargo descriptions, driver assignments, I can cross-reference them with my data and build a pattern. Once I have that, I can take it to the feds and make a case they can't ignore. And if I get caught? Thaddeus asked. If Jolene or anyone else figures out what I'm doing? Then you disappear, Pike said bluntly. You take whatever money you've got saved and you get as far away from here as you can. New city, new job, new identity if you have to. Because once they know you're a threat, they won't stop until you're dealt with. Thaddeus folded the paper and put it in his pocket. I'll think about it, he said. Pike nodded and climbed out of the cab. Don't think too long, he said. Every day you wait is another load moving through those tunnels, and sooner or later, one of them's going to be something you can't ignore. Thaddeus spent the next 2 weeks driving his regular routes and trying to act like nothing had changed. Pittsburgh to Buffalo, Buffalo to Cleveland, Cleveland back to Harrisburg. Standard loads, standard stops, nothing that would draw attention. But every time he pulled into the dispatch office to pick up his next assignment, he felt Jolene's eyes on him, watching for any sign that he was going to make trouble. She never said anything directly, just handed him his paperwork and told him to drive safe. But there was a tension between them now that hadn't been there before. He kept Pike's list folded in his wallet and read through it every night in truck stop parking lots, memorizing the names and companies, trying to figure out how to get access to the dispatch records without getting caught. The company kept everything digital now, stored on servers that required login credentials he didn't have. Jolene's workstation was the only terminal in the trailer office, and she never left it unattended. He'd need another way in. The opportunity came on a Friday afternoon when he delivered a load to a warehouse in Scranton and got back to the dispatch office just after 5 p.m. Jolene was packing up her things, shoving folders into a canvas tote bag, and shutting down her computer. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes and her hair coming loose from its ponytail. "I'm heading out early," she said when Thaddeus walked in. "If you need your next load, it's in the system. Just pull it up on your phone." "You okay?" Thaddeus asked. He wasn't trying to be friendly. He genuinely wanted to know if the stress was getting to her, if she was about to crack. Jolene gave him a hard look. "I'm fine," she said. "Just need a weekend away from all this." She grabbed her tote bag and walked out, letting the door slam behind her. Thaddeus waited until he heard her car start and drive off, then walked to her desk. The computer monitor was dark, the workstation locked. He tried the obvious passwords, her name, the company name, variations of both, but none of them worked. The system was protected, and he didn't have the skills to bypass it. He was about to give up when he noticed the filing cabinet in the corner. It was old, metal, with a lock that looked like it hadn't been changed since the 80s. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and used the flathead screwdriver to pry at the lock mechanism. It took less than 30 seconds to pop it open. Inside were hanging folders organized by year and route number, each one stuffed with printed manifests, bills of lading, and driver logs. Thaddeus pulled out the folders for the last 5 years and spread them across the desk. Most of the documents were standard, legitimate freight moving through normal routes, everything documented and accounted for. But mixed in among them were sheets that had been printed on different paper, slightly yellowed and rough-textured, with handwritten notes in the margins. He pulled one out and examined it. The manifest listed a load of machine parts being transported from a warehouse in Philadelphia to a distribution center in Columbus, but the route section had been left blank. No highway numbers, no mile markers, just a handwritten note that said BR36 and a timestamp. He pulled out another sheet. Same thing. Legitimate cargo description, legitimate origin and destination, but no documented route. Just BR36 or BR50 or BR Breeze. Back roads. The old turnpike. Thaddeus spent the next hour pulling every sheet with a handwritten route code and photographing them with his phone. He found over 200 documents spanning 5 years, all of them using the back route designations, all of them listing cargo that sounded legitimate but had no way station records attached. When he was done, he put the folders back in the cabinet, closed the lock as best he could, and left the office. His hands were shaking as he climbed into his truck and started the engine. He had what Pike needed, proof that the company was routing freight through the old turnpike on a regular basis, proof that it had been going on for years. But he also had a sick feeling in his stomach, because now he was committed. Once he handed this information over to Pike, there was no walking it back. He'd be a witness, an informant, and if the operation found out, Jolene's warning would come true. He pulled out of the lot and drove to a rest area 20 miles south, then sent Pike a text from a burner phone he'd bought at a truck stop. "I have what you need. Where do we meet?" Pike's response came 10 minutes later. "Abandoned way station, Route 220 northbound. Mile marker 47. Midnight." Thaddeus checked the time. It was just past 7 p.m., which gave him 5 hours to drive the route and make sure he wasn't being followed. He merged onto the interstate and kept his speed steady, watching the mirrors for any vehicle that stayed behind him for too long. By the time he reached the way station, it was 11:45, and the highway was nearly empty. The way station had been closed for years, its scale platforms cracked and overgrown with weeds, the inspection building boarded up and covered in graffiti. Thaddeus pulled into the access road and parked near the far end, killing the lights but leaving the engine running. He sat in the darkness and waited. At midnight, a set of headlights turned into the way station and a gray pickup truck pulled up next to the Peterbilt. Algernon Pike climbed out and walked to the passenger side of the cab. Thaddeus unlocked the door and Pike got in, bringing with him the smell of cold air and old coffee. "You got the records?" Pike asked. Thaddeus handed over his phone with the photos loaded. Pike scrolled through them slowly, his expression hardening with each image. When he finished, he handed the phone back. "This is good," he said. "Better than good. This is enough to prove a pattern. If I can cross-reference these manifests with the surveillance data I've been collecting at the tunnel entrances, I can show a federal prosecutor exactly how the operation works. When the loads move, who's transporting them, where they're going. It'll be enough for warrants." "How long will that take?" Thaddeus asked. "Weeks," Pike said. "Maybe months. The feds don't move fast unless there's pressure, and even then they'll want to verify everything before they make a move. In the meantime, you need to keep your head down. Don't take any more routes through the mountains. Don't talk to Jolene about this, and for God's sake, don't go back to that tunnel." "What about the people running the operation?" Thaddeus asked. "If they figure out I took those photos, they're going to come after me." Pike looked at him for a long moment. "They might," he said. "Which is why you need to be smart. Vary your routes, don't sleep in the same place twice, and if you see anything that feels wrong, a vehicle following you, someone asking questions about your loads, you call me immediately." He handed Thaddeus a business card with a phone number written on the back. "That's my personal line. It's secure. Use it if you need help." Thaddeus took the card and put it in his wallet. What happens if the feds don't move fast enough? What happens if the operation figures out you're building a case and shuts everything down before you can get warrants? Pike smiled grimly. "Then we've lost, and they win. But at least we'll have tried." He climbed out of the truck and walked back to his pickup. Thaddeus watched him drive away, then sat alone in the darkness of the way station, listening to the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. The next week passed without incident. Thaddeus hauled loads through Ohio and Pennsylvania, avoiding any routes that took him near the mountains or the old turnpike. He checked his mirrors constantly, looking for tails, and varied his fuel stops and overnight parking spots. Nothing seemed out of place. But on Thursday afternoon, while he was unloading a shipment at a warehouse in Harrisburg, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the depot. Tonight." He stared at the message, his pulse quickening. The depot? That could only mean the Breezewood Maintenance Depot, the place where he'd first encountered Pike and found the smuggling records. He deleted the message and tried to focus on finishing the unload, but his hands were shaking and his mind was racing. Someone knew. Someone had figured out that he'd been at the depot, that he'd taken photos, that he was working with Pike. And now they wanted to meet. He could ignore the message, pretend he'd never seen it, but that would only buy him time. If they wanted to find him, they would. The question was whether he should go to the meeting and find out what they wanted, or disappear right now and hope Pike's case moved fast enough to protect him. He finished the unload and climbed back into his truck, pulling out of the warehouse lot and onto the highway. His next load wasn't scheduled until tomorrow morning, which gave him the night to decide. He drove north on Route 15, watching the sun drop behind the ridgeline, and by the time he reached the turnoff for the old turnpike access road, it was almost dark. He sat at the intersection with his turn signal blinking, the engine idling, trying to convince himself that going to the depot was the stupidest thing he could possibly do. But he couldn't stop thinking about the message. "We need to talk." Not a threat, not a warning, just a request. Maybe it was Pike, using a burner phone to avoid being tracked. Or maybe it was someone else, someone who wanted to offer him a deal or scare him into silence. Either way, he needed to know. He turned onto the access road and drove toward the depot. The maintenance building looked exactly the same as it had 2 weeks ago, dark, abandoned, surrounded by rusted equipment and overgrown weeds. But this time there was a vehicle in the lot, a white van with no markings, parked near the entrance to the main building. Thaddeus pulled the Peterbilt to a stop 50 feet away and left the engine running. He grabbed his flashlight and his tire iron, then climbed down and walked toward the van. The rear doors were closed, and there was no one visible inside the cab. He circled around to the front of the building and saw that the steel door was propped open again, just like before. He called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. He stepped through the doorway into the dark hallway, the flashlight beam cutting through the dust and shadows. The building was silent except for the faint sound of wind whistling through broken windows. He made his way to the staircase and started up to the second floor, each step creaking under his weight. The office at the end of the hall was lit again, the same camping lantern sitting on the desk casting harsh light across the room. But this time the walls were empty. No maps, no manifests, no documents. Everything had been stripped away, and sitting in the chair behind the desk was Minna Lockridge. The tow operator looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. She was wearing the same grease-stained coveralls, and her short gray hair was tucked under a baseball cap. On the desk in front of her was a manila envelope, thick and sealed. "You came," she said. It wasn't a question. "You sent the text," Thaddeus said. "I figured I didn't have much choice." Minna gestured to the chair across from the desk. "Sit down, we don't have a lot of time." Thaddeus sat setting the tire iron on the floor beside him, but keeping it within reach. "What is this about?" "It's about you making a very big mistake," Minna said. "You took photos of documents that don't belong to you. You've been talking to Algernon Pike. And now you've put yourself in a position where people with a lot of money and a lot of power are paying attention to you. That's not a good place to be." "Are you here to threaten me?" Thaddeus asked, "or to make me an offer?" Minna smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Neither," she said. "I'm here to give you information, the kind of information that might keep you alive long enough to see how this plays out." She pushed the manila envelope across the desk. Thaddeus opened it and pulled out a stack of papers. More manifests, more route logs, but these were different from the ones he'd photographed. These documents listed cargo that wasn't machine parts or raw materials. They listed specialty freight and high-value goods with delivery locations that were warehouse addresses in cities he didn't recognize. And every single one of them had the same handwritten note in the margin: "Pike Oversight, approved." Thaddeus looked up at Minna. "What is this?" "Proof that Algernon Pike isn't as clean as he pretends to be," Minna said. "He's been running his own side operation for years, using the same tunnels and the same routes as everyone else. The difference is that he's been documenting everyone else's activity to cover his own tracks. You think he's building a case to shut down the smuggling ring? He's building a case to eliminate his competition." Thaddeus felt the floor drop out from under him. He looked at the documents again, reading the dates and the cargo descriptions. If this was real, if Pike had been running freight through the tunnels himself, then everything he'd said, everything he'd promised, was a lie. "Why are you showing me this?" Thaddeus asked. "Because you're a loose end," Minna said. "And loose ends don't last long in this business. Pike knows you have photos of the company records. He knows you can connect him to the operation if anyone starts digging. So either he's going to use you to build his case and then make sure you disappear before you can testify, or he's going to get rid of you right now and claim you were part of the smuggling ring all along. Either way, you're not walking away from this." Thaddeus set the papers down on the desk, his hands trembling. "So what am I supposed to do?" Minna leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "You leave, tonight. You get in your truck and you drive as far away from here as you can. You don't contact Pike, you don't go to the police, you don't try to be a hero, you just disappear. And if you're smart, you stay disappeared." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. And if I don't? Then you'll end up like the other drivers who ask too many questions, Minna said. There's a reason the old turnpike has a reputation, Rook. It's not just because of the tunnels or the smuggling. It's because people go in there and they don't come out. And the ones who do come out are smart enough to keep their mouths shut. She stood up and walked to the door. You've got until sunrise to make your decision. After that, I can't help you. She left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway and fading into silence. Thaddeus sat alone in the office, staring at the documents on the desk. He pulled out his phone and looked at the business card Pike had given him, the secure number written on the back. He could call right now, confront Pike, demand an explanation. But what if Minna was telling the truth? What if Pike was playing both sides? He thought about the van in the tunnel, the voice on the CB warning him to stop, the way Pike had found him so easily at the rest area. He thought about Jolene's fear, Minna's warning, and the manifests with Pike's name in the margins. He stood up and walked out of the office, down the stairs, and out into the cold night air. The white van was gone now, and his Peterbilt sat alone in the gravel lot, the engine still idling. He climbed into the cab and sat there with his hands on the wheel, staring at the dark shape of the maintenance building. He had three choices. He could run, like Minna had suggested, and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. He could go to the police with everything he knew and hope they'd protect him long enough to make a case. Or he could go back into that tunnel, find out what was really being moved through there, and get proof that would force someone, anyone, to pay attention. None of the options were good, but running felt like giving up, and going to the police felt like signing his own death warrant, which left the tunnel. Thaddeus shifted the Peterbilt into gear and pulled out of the lot, heading south on the access road. He knew where the tunnel entrances were now. He'd studied the maps in Pike's office, memorized the routes and the access points. The second tunnel, Sidling Hill, was less than 5 miles from here, and according to the logs he'd seen, there was activity there almost every night. If he was going to get proof, that was where he needed to be. The road narrowed as he drove, the trees closing in on both sides, and then he saw the chain-link fence and the gap where someone had peeled back the mesh. He drove through and onto the old roadbed, the cracked pavement stretching ahead into darkness. The tunnel entrance loomed in his headlights, a massive stone arch with rust stains streaking the walls and the word "closed" spray-painted above the opening. He brought the truck to a stop and sat there with the engine idling, his heart pounding in his chest. This was insane. He knew it was insane, but he also knew that if he didn't do this now, he'd never have the courage to do it later. He shifted into gear and drove into the tunnel. The darkness swallowed him immediately, the headlights barely penetrating the black void ahead. The road inside was worse than Ray's Hill, potholes deep enough to swallow a tire, debris piled in drifts against the walls, water dripping from cracks in the ceiling. He kept his speed at 10 miles per hour and focused on keeping the truck centered in the lane. Halfway through, he saw lights ahead, not headlights but work lamps, the kind used on construction sites. They were set up on tripods around a flatbed truck parked in the middle of the tunnel, and there were people moving around it, loading crates onto the bed. Thaddeus slowed to a crawl and pulled to the side, killing his headlights but leaving the engine running. He grabbed his phone and started recording video through the windshield. The people loading the truck were wearing dark clothes and moving quickly, efficiently, like they'd done this 100 times before. The crates were unmarked, but they were heavy. 2 men struggled to lift each one. And standing near the cab of the flatbed, supervising the operation, was Algernon Pike. Thaddeus felt his blood run cold. Minna had been telling the truth. Pike wasn't building a case against the smuggling ring. He was part of it. And now Thaddeus had video proof. He kept recording for another 30 seconds, capturing Pike's face in the harsh light of the work lamps. then stopped the video and put the phone in his pocket. He needed to get out of here before they noticed him. He shifted into reverse and started backing out of the tunnel, moving as quietly as he could. But the Peterbilt's backup alarm started beeping, loud and piercing in the confined space, and he saw the figures around the flatbed turn toward him. Pike shouted something, and the work lamps swung in his direction, blinding him. Thaddeus threw the truck into drive and hit the accelerator, the engine roaring as the tires fought for traction on the wet pavement. Behind him, he heard shouting and the sound of a vehicle starting. He didn't look back. He just drove, pushing the Peterbilt as fast as it would go through the tunnel, the walls flashing past in the headlights. He burst out of the exit and onto the open roadbed, accelerating hard, the flatbed trailer fishtailing behind him. In the rearview mirror, he saw headlights emerge from the tunnel, Pike's pickup, gaining fast. The old turnpike stretched ahead, cracked and broken, and Thaddeus pushed the truck to 60, 70, the engine screaming. He reached the gap in the fence and drove through, the chain link scraping along the trailer, and then he was on the active state route, merging into traffic. Pike's truck stayed behind him for another mile, then fell back and disappeared. Thaddeus kept driving, his hands locked on the wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he reached a truck stop 30 miles north, where he parked in the back lot and sat in the darkness with the engine off. His phone was still in his pocket, the video still saved. He pulled it out and watched it again, Pike's face in the work lamp light. The crates being loaded. The flatbed truck with no plates. It was proof. Real, undeniable proof. But proof of what exactly? That Pike was dirty? That the operation was bigger than anyone thought? That Thaddeus was now a target for people on both sides of the law? He didn't know. And as he sat there in the dark watching the other trucks come and go, he realized that he might never know. Because the truth about the old turnpike, about who was really running it, about where the cargo was going, about how deep the corruption went, was buried under decades of lies and violence and silence. And the only way to uncover it would be to keep digging, keep asking questions, keep driving into the tunnels even when every instinct told him to run. Thaddeus started the engine and pulled out of the truck stop, heading north on the interstate. He didn't know where he was going, he didn't know who he could trust, but he knew one thing. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The road stretched ahead into the darkness, and he drove toward it, alone. Boaz Whitlock had been driving the western routes long enough to know that the old highways were dying. Not abandoned like the Pennsylvania Turnpike or the ghost towns scattered across Nevada, but dying slow, bypassed by interstates, forgotten by GPS systems, left to crack and fade under the desert sun while 18-wheelers roared past on the new pavement a mile away. Route 66 was the most famous of the dying roads, romanticized in songs and movies, but the reality was less nostalgic. Most of the original alignment had been paved over or rerouted decades ago, and what remained were disconnected fragments that led nowhere useful, stretches of two-lane blacktop lined with shuttered motels and collapsed gas stations, used only by locals and the occasional tourist chasing history. Boaz had driven parts of the old route before, usually by accident when his GPS glitched or when he missed an interstate exit, but he'd never deliberately sought it out. There was no reason to. The freight business ran on efficiency, and the old highways were anything but efficient, until the dispatcher gave him a load that changed everything. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while he was unloading paper goods at a distribution center outside Albuquerque. His phone buzzed with a text from the brokerage firm he contracted with. Priority load. Flagstaff to Tucumcari. Pick up tonight. Premium rate. Boaz finished securing the empty flatbed and called the dispatcher back. The woman on the other end, he didn't recognize her voice, which was unusual, gave him the details in a flat, hurried tone. The pickup was at a commercial warehouse on the west side of Flagstaff, the delivery at a processing facility in Tucumcari, and the load was agricultural equipment, 52,000 pounds, tarped and strapped. The premium rate was double his usual per-mile fee, which immediately raised questions, but when he asked why the rush, the dispatcher just said the client was paying for speed and discretion. Discretion, Boaz repeated. What does that mean? It means you take the load, you drive the route we give you, and you don't ask questions, the dispatcher said. You interested or not? Boaz thought about it. Double rate meant he could cover his truck payment for the month with one run, and he needed the money. His Kenworth had been burning oil lately, and the mechanic said the engine needed a rebuild he couldn't afford yet. I'm interested, he said. Send me the details. The route came through 10 minutes later as a PDF attachment, and when Boaz opened it, he frowned. The directions didn't follow I-40, like every sensible route between Flagstaff and Tucumcari would. Instead, it took him north out of Flagstaff on US 89, then east on a series of unmarked county roads that reconnected with the old Route 66 alignment somewhere near the New Mexico border. From there, the route followed the abandoned highway east through a stretch of desert that had been bypassed when the interstate was built in the 60s. The total distance was about 40 miles longer than the direct route, which made no sense if the client was paying for speed. Boaz called the dispatcher back. This route you sent me, it's not the fastest way to Tucumcari. It's the route the client specified, the dispatcher said. Non-negotiable. Why? Boaz asked. What's wrong with taking I-40? Nothing's wrong with it, the dispatcher said. But the client doesn't want their freight on the interstate. They want it moved quiet, off the main roads. That's what you're being paid for. She hung up before he could ask anything else. Boaz sat in the cab of his Kenworth and stared at the route map on his phone. Something about this felt wrong. Legitimate freight didn't avoid interstates, avoiding way stations, avoiding inspection. That was the kind of thing smugglers and black market operators did. But the load description said agricultural equipment, which was about as mundane as freight got, and the warehouse in Flagstaff was a real address, not some unmarked building in an industrial park. He could refuse the load and take the safe route, but then he'd be walking away from the best-paying run he'd been offered in months. And if the client wanted to pay double for a weird route, that was their business, not his. He started the engine and headed west toward Flagstaff. He'd pick up the load, drive the route, and collect his money. If it turned out to be something illegal, he'd dump the trailer and call the cops. But for now, he was willing to give the benefit of the doubt. He reached Flagstaff just after sunset and followed the GPS to the warehouse address on the west side of town. It was a low, concrete building surrounded by chain-link fence, set back from the road in an industrial area that looked half-abandoned. The parking lot was empty except for a single semi-trailer sitting near the loading dock, a 53-foot dry van with no company markings. Boaz backed his Kenworth up to the trailer and climbed down to inspect the hookup. The trailer was newer than he'd expected, the paint clean and the tires in good condition, but there were no placards indicating what was inside and no dot numbers on the sides. The kingpin locked into place without issue, and he connected the airlines and electrical cable, then walked around to check the trailer doors. They were sealed with a heavy-duty padlock and a numbered tamper seal. He took a photo of the seal number with his phone, standard practice, and climbed back into the cab. The paperwork had been left on the driver's seat, a bill of lading listing the load as agricultural machinery disassembled. Weight 52,000 pounds. Destination Tucumcari. The shipper and receiver fields were filled in with company names he didn't recognize. He folded the paperwork and tucked it into his logbook, then pulled out of the lot and headed north on US 89. The highway out of Flagstaff was quiet, 2 lanes cutting through pine forest that gradually gave way to high desert scrubland. Boaz kept his speed at 60 and watched the fuel gauge, which was sitting just above 3/4. He'd filled up before leaving Albuquerque, which should give him enough to reach Tucumcari with a comfortable margin, assuming the route didn't add too many unexpected miles. The turnoff onto the county roads came 20 miles north of town, marked by a faded sign that said, Holbrook, 47 miles. He took the exit and followed the cracked 2-lane blacktop east, the road narrowing and roughening as he left the main highway behind. The landscape here was empty, flat stretches of sagebrush and red dirt, broken by low mesas and dry arroyos, with no lights or structures visible in any direction. The only sign of civilization was the occasional mile marker, rusted and leaning at angles, and the faint outline of old telephone poles running parallel to the road. After 30 miles, the county road intersected with what the map labeled as Historic Route 66, though there was nothing historic about it. It was just another stretch of forgotten asphalt, cracked and patched and fading into the desert. Boaz turned onto the old route and immediately felt the difference. The pavement here was worse, potholes every 50 feet, sections where the asphalt had completely eroded away to gravel, and long stretches where the road had been swallowed by sand drifts. He slowed to 40 miles per hour and focused on steering around the worst of the damage, feeling the trailer sway behind him as the wheels hit uneven ground. The CB radio crackled with static, and he reached up to adjust the squelch, but the interference didn't clear. He scanned through the channels, looking for other drivers, but found only silence. This far off the interstate, there was nobody else on the road. The headlights picked out the shapes of abandoned structures as he drove. A collapsed motor lodge with its roof caved in, a gas station with empty pump islands and shattered windows, a diner whose sign had long since fallen into the dirt. Each one was marked by a faded mile marker, the numbers barely legible, mile 217, mile 221, mile 225. The markers were evenly spaced, which meant the road had been measured and maintained once, but that had been a long time ago. Then, around mile 230, Boaz noticed something strange. The mile marker was broken. Not weathered or faded, but physically shattered. The metal post snapped off at ground level and the sign lying in the dirt beside the road. He slowed the Kenworth and looked at it as he passed. The break was clean, almost deliberate, like someone had cut it with a torch or smashed it with something heavy. He kept driving, and at mile 232, he saw another broken marker. Then another at mile 234. Every marker from that point forward had been destroyed, the posts cut or bent, the signs torn down or spray-painted over. He picked up the CB handset and keyed the mic, more out of habit than expectation. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Kenworth on Old Route 66 near the New Mexico line. Anyone monitoring? Static hissed back at him. He tried again, switching channels, but got nothing. The road ahead curved to the south, following the contour of a low mesa, and as Boaz rounded the bend, his headlights caught something in the middle of the pavement. He eased off the throttle and brought the Kenworth to a crawl. It was a vehicle, another semi, parked at an angle across both lanes with its hazard lights on. Boaz stopped 50 feet back and left his engine running, the high beams illuminating the other truck. It was an older Peterbilt, a day cab with a 48-foot reefer trailer, painted white with no company logos. The driver's door was hanging open, and the cab was dark. He grabbed his flashlight and his tire iron and climbed down, his boots crunching on the broken asphalt. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint smell of diesel and something else, something metallic and sharp that he couldn't place. He walked toward the Peterbilt slowly, calling out as he approached. "Hey, anyone here? You need help?" No response. The only sound was the idle of his own engine behind him and the faint whisper of wind across the desert. He reached the open door and shined his flashlight inside. The cab was empty. The driver's seat was pushed back, and there was a jacket draped over the passenger seat, but no sign of the driver. The keys were still in the ignition and the fuel gauge showed half a tank. On the dashboard was a CB handset, dangling from its coil cord, and a half-empty bottle of water in the cup holder. Everything looked normal, except for the fact that the driver was gone. Boaz stepped back and swept his flashlight across the ground. There were tire tracks in the dirt on the shoulder. Multiple sets, leading away from the Peterbilt toward the desert. He followed them with the flashlight beam and saw shapes in the darkness. Vehicles, 3 or 4 of them, parked in a cluster about 100 yards off the road. They were vans or SUVs, dark-colored with no lights. He felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a setup. He turned and started walking back toward his Kenworth, moving quickly but trying not to run. He'd gone maybe 20 feet when the CB radio in his cab erupted with a voice, loud and distorted by static. "Get out of there! Now! Don't stop!" Boaz broke into a run. He reached the Kenworth and climbed into the cab, slamming the door and locking it. His hands were shaking as he grabbed the CB handset and keyed the mic. "Who is this? What's going on?" The voice came back, clearer this time. "You're in the wrong place. They're watching you. You need to move." "Who's watching?" Boaz demanded. "Who are you?" But the transmission cut off, replaced by static. Boaz looked in his side mirrors. The shapes in the desert were still there, but now he could see movement. Flashlight beams, people walking toward the road. He shifted the Kenworth into gear and started forward, angling to the left to squeeze past the abandoned Peterbilt. The gap was tight, maybe 2 feet on each side, and he had to fold in his mirrors to avoid clipping them on the other truck's trailer. The Kenworth scraped along the side of the Peterbilt with a metallic screech, and then he was past, accelerating hard. In the rearview mirror, he saw the flashlight beams converge on the road behind him, and then headlights flared to life. The vehicles in the desert were moving, pulling onto the road and following him. Boaz pushed the Kenworth up to 50, then 60, the trailer bouncing over the broken pavement. The headlights behind him were gaining, 3 sets now, staying close. He grabbed the CB handset again and tried calling for help, but the radio was dead, just static and interference. His phone showed no signal. He was alone on a forgotten highway in the middle of the desert, being chased by people he couldn't identify, hauling a load he didn't understand. The road ahead curved sharply to the right, and Boaz downshifted and took the turn wide, feeling the trailer slide on the loose gravel. The headlights behind him stayed close, and he could see now that they were SUVs, big ones, with light bars on the roofs. They weren't trying to run him off the road. They were just following, keeping pace, like they were herding him somewhere. He thought about the route the dispatcher had given him, the specific roads and turns, and realized with a sickening clarity that he'd been sent here on purpose. The load, the premium rate, the off-interstate route. It was all part of something bigger, something he'd walked into without knowing. The question was whether he could get out before it was too late. The mile markers continued to flash past in his headlights. Mile 240, mile 245, mile 250, each one broken or missing, the road getting worse with every mile. And then, just as he was starting to think the chase would go on forever, the headlights behind him suddenly fell back and disappeared. Boaz kept driving, watching the mirrors, but the road behind him was dark. They were gone. He didn't slow down. He kept the Kenworth at 60 and focused on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. After another 10 miles, the old Route 66 alignment reconnected with the paved state highway, and he saw lights in the distance, a small town, or at least a gas station. He pulled off at the first exit and brought the truck to a stop in a gravel lot, the engine idling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty road, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The CB radio crackled again, and the same voice came through, calm and measured. "You made it." "Good. Now listen carefully. Don't open that trailer. Don't stop anywhere until you reach Tucumcari, and don't talk to anyone about what you saw tonight. If you do, they'll come for you, and next time they won't just follow." The transmission ended. Boaz sat in the darkness, alone, with a 52,000-pound load he didn't dare inspect, and a route that was supposed to take him deeper into the desert. And somewhere behind him, on a stretch of broken highway that didn't exist on any current map, people were waiting for the next truck to come through. Boaz stayed in that gravel lot for 20 minutes, watching the empty highway and trying to decide if he should call the police. Every instinct told him that whatever was in the trailer behind him wasn't agricultural equipment, and if he delivered it to Tucumcari, he'd be complicit in something illegal. But the voice on the CB had been clear: "Don't talk to anyone, or they'll come for you." And the way those SUVs had followed him, coordinated and deliberate, suggested an organization with resources and reach. If he called the cops now, would they even believe him? He had no proof of the chase except his own word, and the trailer was still sealed with the tamper-evident lock. Breaking that seal without authorization would void his insurance and likely get him fired from the brokerage contract. He could drive to the nearest truck scale and request an inspection, but if the load turned out to be legitimate, he'd look paranoid and unreliable. And if it wasn't legitimate, the people who'd been following him would know he'd talked. Either way, he was trapped. He pulled out his phone and opened the navigation app, checking the route to Tucumcari. It was another 120 miles, most of it on state highways that reconnected with I-40 near Santa Rosa. He could take that route, stay on paved roads with traffic and lights, and deliver the load without incident. Or he could follow the original route the dispatcher had sent him, which continued east on the old Route 66 alignment for another 60 miles before rejoining the interstate. The safe choice was obvious, but something about the way the voice on the CB had emphasized "don't stop anywhere until you reach Tucumcari" made him think the route mattered. If he deviated from it, if he took the interstate instead of the old highway, would they come after him again? He didn't know, and not knowing was worse than any certainty. He started the Kenworth and pulled back onto the state highway, heading east. He'd follow the route. He'd deliver the load. And then he'd figure out what to do next. The road ahead was smoother now, recently repaved, with functioning streetlights and occasional traffic, mostly local vehicles, a few late-night commuters. Boaz kept his speed at the limit and watched the mirrors, but the SUVs didn't reappear. After 15 miles, the state highway intersected with another section of old Route 66, marked by a weathered brown sign that said, "Historic Route, next exit." He took the exit and found himself back on the broken 2-lane blacktop, the pavement cracked and potholed, the shoulders eroded into gravel. The transition from civilization to abandonment was jarring, like crossing a border into a place that time had forgotten. The headlights picked out more ruined structures as he drove, a collapsed bridge over a dry wash, a line of derelict buildings that might have been a rest stop once, and more broken mile markers, the posts cut or bent, the signs unreadable. He checked the odometer and the route map on his phone. According to the directions, he had another 40 miles of this before the old highway reconnected with I-40. 40 miles of empty desert and crumbling asphalt, with no services, no help, and no way to call for backup if something went wrong. Then, at mile 267, he saw something that made him slow down. There was a figure standing on the side of the road. Boaz brought the Kenworth to a crawl and leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, older, maybe 60 or 70, wearing faded jeans and a canvas work jacket. He was holding a flashlight and waving it slowly back and forth, the universal signal for help. Boaz's first instinct was to stop. You didn't leave people stranded in the desert. But the memory of the abandoned Peterbilt and the voice on the CB made him hesitate. What if this was another setup? What if the man was bait, meant to get him out of the truck so they could take the load? He slowed to a stop about 30 feet from the figure and left the engine running, then grabbed the CB handset and tried calling again. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Kenworth on Old Route 66, mile 267. I've got someone flagging me down. Anyone monitoring? Static. He set the handset down and looked at the man again. The figure hadn't moved, just kept waving the flashlight slowly. Boaz unlocked his door and climbed down, keeping the tire iron in his hand and his back to the truck. "You need help?" he called out. The man lowered the flashlight and walked toward him, moving with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who'd spent too many years on his feet. As he got closer, Boaz could see his face, deeply lined, weathered by sun and wind, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You're hauling a load through here," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Boaz said cautiously. "What's it to you?" "It's everything to me," the man said. "My name's Lucian Baird. I used to be a highway inspector for this stretch of Route 66 back before they closed it. Spent 30 years maintaining this road, measuring the markers, checking the pavement. And for the last 20 years, I've been watching what happens to the drivers who come through here at night." Boaz tightened his grip on the tire iron. "What do you mean, what happens to them?" Lucian gestured toward the broken mile markers scattered along the roadside. "You see those? They didn't break by accident. They were cut down deliberately, years ago, to make this stretch of road harder to navigate. No markers means no reference points, no way to know exactly where you are. And when you don't know where you are, you can't report what you see." "Who cut them down?" Boaz asked. "The people who've been using this road to move freight they don't want documented," Lucian said. "Drugs, weapons, stolen goods, anything that needs to get from Arizona to Texas without going through a weigh station or an inspection checkpoint. They started using the old Route 66 alignment about 15 years ago, right after the state officially decommissioned it. At first, it was just a few loads a month, but now it's dozens, maybe more. I've been documenting it, taking photos, recording license plates, but nobody listens. The state says it's not their jurisdiction anymore, and the feds say they don't have the resources to patrol a decommissioned highway." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to Boaz. "That's a list of every trailer I've seen come through here in the last 6 months. Company names, plate numbers, cargo descriptions when I could get them. You're the 43rd this month." Boaz unfolded the paper and scanned it. The list was handwritten in neat, precise script, with dates and times and vehicle descriptions. Some of the entries had notes in the margins. No DOT markings, tamper seal removed, followed by escort vehicles. His stomach tightened as he read. "Why are you telling me this?" Boaz asked. "Because you're different," Lucian said. "Most of the drivers who come through here are part of the operation. They know what they're hauling and they know where it's going. But you stopped. You looked at that abandoned truck back at mile 230, and you ran when they started following you. That tells me you're not one of them, which means you're in danger." "What kind of danger?" Boaz asked. Lucian looked back down the road, toward the darkness where the SUVs had disappeared. "The kind where you don't make it to Tucumcari," he said. The loads that come through here on the route you're driving, they're not meant to arrive at their listed destinations. They get diverted somewhere along the way, transferred to other vehicles, repackaged and rerouted. The drivers who cooperate get paid and sent on their way. The ones who don't cooperate, well, there's a reason this stretch of road has so many abandoned trucks. Boaz felt his mouth go dry. You're saying they kill drivers who don't play along? I'm saying I've seen 15 trucks abandoned on this road in the last 5 years, Lucian said, and none of the drivers were ever found. Not by the police, not by their families, not by anyone. They just vanished. Boaz looked back at his Kenworth, the trailer sitting dark and silent in the headlights. So what am I supposed to do? I can't just dump the load and walk away. I don't even know what's in there. You don't want to know, Lucian said. Trust me. The best thing you can do is keep driving, deliver the load to Tucumcari like you were told, and never take a job through here again. If you try to open that trailer or report what you've seen, they'll know, and they'll come for you. How will they know? Boaz asked. Lucian pointed at the trailer. Because they're tracking it. Every load that comes through here has a GPS unit hidden inside the trailer frame. I've seen them install the trackers at the pickup points. They know where you are, how fast you're going, and if you stop for longer than a few minutes. If you deviate from the route or try to inspect the cargo, they'll intercept you before you can do anything about it. Boaz felt a chill run down his spine. He walked back to the trailer and ran his flashlight along the underside of the frame, looking for anything that didn't belong. Near the front axle, tucked into a recessed bracket, he found it, a small black box about the size of a deck of cards, with a blinking red LED and a stubby antenna. He reached up and tried to pry it loose, but it was secured with heavy-duty zip ties and industrial adhesive. Don't, Lucian said sharply. If you remove that tracker, they'll know immediately. The signal will go dead, and they'll send someone to find out why. Your only option is to leave it alone and finish the route. Boaz stepped back from the trailer, his mind racing. If the load was being tracked, then everything he did, every stop, every turn, every deviation, was being monitored in real time. Which meant the people running this operation knew exactly where he was right now, knew he'd stopped to talk to Lucian, and were probably deciding what to do about it. He looked at Lucian again. Why are you still here? If you've been documenting this for years and nobody's listening, why haven't you just left? Lucian smiled grimly. Because someone has to keep a record, he said. Someone has to know what's happening out here, even if nobody else cares. I worked this road for 30 years. I measured every mile, inspected every bridge, replaced every marker. This was my highway, and I'm not going to let it die in silence. He turned and started walking back towards the darkness, the flashlight beam bobbing in the night. Good luck, driver. You're going to need it. Boaz climbed back into the Kenworth and sat there for a moment, trying to process everything Lucian had told him. The tracker, the abandoned drivers, the diverted loads, it all painted a picture of an operation far bigger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. And now he was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. He shifted into gear and started driving, following the route east. The mile markers continued to flash past, broken and illegible, and the road got worse with every mile, potholes deep enough to jolt the entire truck, sections where the pavement had been washed away entirely by flash floods. He kept his speed at 40 and focused on keeping the trailer upright. Around mile 280, he saw lights ahead, not headlights but stationary work lamps, the kind used at construction sites. He slowed down and saw that the road ahead was blocked by a vehicle, a flatbed tow truck with its amber flashers on, parked diagonally across both lanes. A man was standing beside it, wearing grease-stained coveralls and a reflective safety vest. He waved at Boaz to stop. Boaz brought the Kenworth to a halt about 50 feet back and left the engine running. His first thought was that this was another setup, but the tow truck looked legitimate, dented and weathered, with magnetic door signs that read, "Ledbetter Recovery" in faded lettering. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed down, approaching cautiously. The man in the coveralls looked up as he approached. He was younger than Lucian, maybe 45, with a thick build and a face that suggested he'd spent most of his life working outdoors. "You the driver, hauling to Tucumcari?" the man asked. Boaz nodded slowly. "Yeah, what's this about?" "Name's Cormac Ledbetter. I run recovery and towing for this area. Got a call about an hour ago saying you might need assistance out here." "I didn't call anyone," Boaz said. Cormac shrugged. "Dispatcher did. Said you were running a priority load and they wanted to make sure you had support if anything went wrong. Standard procedure for high-value freight." Boaz felt his suspicion deepen. "What kind of support?" "Escort," Cormac said. "I'm supposed to follow you the rest of the way to Tucumcari. Make sure you don't have any breakdowns or trouble. They're paying me double rate to stay with you until the load's delivered." Boaz looked at the tow truck, then back at Cormac. "Who called you? Give me a name." "Didn't get a name," Cormac said. "Just a phone number and a credit card. But the payment cleared, so I'm here." He gestured toward the road ahead. "You want to get moving? The sooner we get you to Tucumcari, the sooner I can get home." Boaz didn't move. "How long have you been doing recovery work out here?" 10 years, Cormac said. "Mostly pulling vehicles out of ditches and towing abandoned trucks. There's a lot of those on this stretch. People break down and just walk away." "Ever wonder why so many trucks get abandoned?" Boaz asked. Cormac's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tension. "Not my job to wonder," he said. "My job is to clear the road and collect my fee, same as yours." Boaz stared at him for a long moment, trying to read whether Cormac was part of the operation or just another contractor caught in the middle. He couldn't tell. "I don't need an escort," Boaz said finally. "I'm fine on my own." "That's not up to you," Cormac said. "Dispatcher paid for the service, so you're getting the service. Now, get back in your truck and let's move." He walked back to the tow truck and climbed into the cab, starting the engine. Boaz stood there on the broken pavement, watching the amber flashers pulse in the darkness, and realized he had no choice. If he refused to let Cormac follow him, the people tracking the load would know he was resisting. And if Lucian was right about what happened to drivers who didn't cooperate, refusing wasn't an option. He walked back to the Kenworth and climbed in, shifting into gear. Cormac's tow truck pulled to the side and let him pass, then fell in behind him, staying about 100 feet back. Boaz watched it in the mirrors, the headlights steady and unblinking, and tried not to think about what would happen when they reached Tucumcari. The road ahead was dark and empty, and the broken mile markers kept flashing past, silent witnesses to whatever was coming next. They drove for another 40 miles through the desert darkness, Boaz in the lead with Cormac's tow truck following at a constant distance behind. The road conditions deteriorated further as they went. Long sections where the asphalt had been completely scoured away by wind and flash floods, leaving only gravel and hard-packed dirt that sent vibrations rattling through the entire truck. Boaz kept his speed at 35 and watched the fuel gauge, which was now sitting at half a tank. He'd burned more fuel than expected navigating the rough terrain, but he still had enough to reach Tucumcari with a margin to spare. The trailer behind him felt heavier than the paperwork claimed, the way it pulled on the corners and resisted braking, and he found himself wondering again what was actually inside. Agricultural equipment shouldn't feel this dense. Machinery had weight, but it was distributed across the bed of the trailer in a way that balanced naturally. This load felt concentrated, like solid mass rather than assembled parts. He thought about the GPS tracker Lucian had shown him and wondered if there were cameras too, hidden in the trailer or mounted on the exterior, watching everything he did. Around mile 305, the old Route 66 alignment finally reconnected with I-40, merging onto a modern on-ramp that looked absurdly out of place after hours of crumbling pavement. Boaz accelerated onto the interstate and felt the Kenworth settle into a smooth, steady rhythm for the first time since leaving Flagstaff. The contrast was jarring. 4 lanes of perfect asphalt, evenly spaced reflectors, overhead lights at every interchange. Civilization. He glanced in the mirror and saw Cormac's tow truck merge behind him, maintaining the same 100-foot following distance. Now that they were on the interstate, other vehicles appeared. A few late-night commuters, a couple of long-haul truckers running night shifts. Boaz picked up the CB handset and scanned through the channels, listening to the normal chatter. Drivers talking about traffic conditions, rest stop locations, fuel prices. It all sounded impossibly mundane compared to what he'd just experienced. He keyed the mic and tried calling out. "Breaker 19. This is eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 12 on I-40. Anyone running east toward Tucumcari?" A voice crackled back almost immediately. "Roger that, eastbound Kenworth. This is westbound Pete at mile marker 37. Roads are clear all the way to Santa Rosa. Safe travels." The simple normalcy of the exchange made Boaz's throat tighten. He drove another 30 miles on the interstate before his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and saw it was from an unknown number. Exit 333. Follow service road north. Delivery location changed. Boaz felt his stomach drop. He looked at the original route paperwork clipped to his visor. The destination was still listed as Tucumcari, another 40 miles east on I-40. But now someone was telling him to exit early and take a service road. He thought about Lucian's warning, about loads getting diverted and transferred to other vehicles, about drivers who disappeared. This was it. This was where they took the cargo and decided what to do with him. He could ignore the text, stay on the interstate, and drive straight to the original destination. But if the people tracking the load wanted him to exit at 333, they'd know the moment he passed it. And Cormac was still following behind him, close enough to block him in if he tried to run. He was boxed in, monitored, and out of options. He signaled for the exit and took the off-ramp, Cormac's tow truck following without hesitation. The service road was narrow and poorly lit, running parallel to the interstate for about a mile before branching north into open desert. Boaz followed it, watching the odometer tick upward, until his headlights picked out a cluster of buildings ahead. A small industrial complex surrounded by chain-link fence with a gravel lot and a loading dock. There were no signs indicating what the facility was, just a number painted on the side of the main building, 333, the same as the exit number. Boaz pulled into the lot and brought the Kenworth to a stop near the loading dock, leaving the engine running. Cormac's tow truck parked beside him, and the driver climbed out, walking over to Boaz's cab. Boaz rolled down his window. "This isn't Tucumcari," he said. "No," Cormac agreed. "It's not, but this is where the load goes." "My paperwork says Tucumcari," Boaz said. "Paperwork changes," Cormac said. "You'll get new documents once the transfer is complete." "What transfer?" Boaz demanded. Cormac gestured toward the loading dock where a roll-up door was opening, revealing the lit interior of a warehouse. "Just back your trailer up to the dock and let them unload. You'll be back on the road in an hour." Boaz looked at the warehouse, then back at Cormac. What if I refuse? Cormac's expression hardened. Then you don't get paid, and you don't get to leave. Your choice. Boaz sat there for a moment, weighing his options. He could try to drive away, but Cormac's tow truck was positioned to block the exit, and there were probably other vehicles nearby waiting. He could call the police, but his phone still showed only one bar of signal, and by the time anyone arrived, the transfer would be complete, and he'd be left trying to explain why he'd deviated from his original route. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to do what Cormac said. Back the trailer to the dock, let them unload whatever was inside, and get out of here. He could always report it later, after he was clear. But something about that felt wrong, like cooperating made him complicit in whatever this was. He shifted the Kenworth into reverse and backed the trailer up to the loading dock, the backup alarm beeping in the quiet night. The dock workers appeared almost immediately. 4 men in dark coveralls, moving with practiced efficiency. They broke the tamper seal on the trailer doors and swung them open, then started unloading the cargo with an electric pallet jack. Boaz climbed down from the cab and walked to the back of the trailer, trying to get a look at what they were unloading. The men blocked his view, but he could see enough to know it wasn't agricultural equipment. The crates were wooden, unmarked, about 4 feet on each side. They were heavy. The pallet jack struggled with each one, the electric motor whining. The men worked in silence, not speaking to each other or acknowledging Boaz's presence. Within 20 minutes, they'd unloaded 30 crates and stacked them inside the warehouse. When the trailer was empty, one of the men walked over and handed Boaz a clipboard with new paperwork. A revised bill of lading listing the cargo as industrial components, and the delivery location as Facility 333. The weight was listed as 52,000 pounds, same as before, but the shipper and receiver fields were blank. "Sign here," the man said, pointing to a line at the bottom of the form. Boaz took the clipboard, but didn't sign. "What was in those crates?" "Not your concern," the man said. "You delivered the load. Now sign the paperwork so you can get paid and leave." Boaz looked at the form again. If he signed it, he'd be acknowledging that he'd delivered the cargo to this location, which would create a paper trail linking him to whatever illegal operation was happening here. But if he didn't sign, he wouldn't get paid, and he'd still be stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way out. He signed the form and handed it back. The man tore off the bottom copy and gave it to Boaz, then walked back into the warehouse. The roll-up doors started closing, the metal slats rattling as they descended. Within seconds, the dock was empty and dark again, like nothing had happened. Cormac walked over, his hands in his pockets. "Good job," he said. "You did what you were supposed to. Now get back on the interstate and head to Tucumcari. Your dispatcher will have your next load by the time you arrive." "What was in those crates?" Boaz asked. Cormac smiled thinly. "Agricultural equipment, just like the paperwork said." "Bullshit," Boaz said. "That wasn't farm machinery. That was something else." "Then it's a good thing you signed the delivery form and can't prove otherwise," Cormac said. He walked back to his tow truck and climbed in, starting the engine. Boaz stood there in the gravel lot, holding the revised bill of lading, watching Cormac drive away. The industrial complex behind him was dark and silent. No lights in the windows, no indication that anyone was still inside. He walked back to his Kenworth and climbed into the cab, sitting there in the darkness with the engine idling. He pulled out his phone and took photos of the revised paperwork, the warehouse number and the surrounding area. Then he opened his contacts and found the number for the brokerage firm that had booked him on this load. He called it, even though it was past midnight, and wasn't surprised when it went straight to voicemail. He left a message. "This is Boaz Whitlock, driver ID 7249. I just delivered a load to an unauthorized location that wasn't on my original route. I need to speak to someone about this immediately. Call me back." He ended the call and sat there, waiting. His phone didn't ring. He tried to calling again and got the same voicemail. He tried the dispatcher who'd originally contacted him, but that number went to a disconnected message. It was like the entire brokerage had vanished. He opened his banking app and checked his account balance, wondering if the payment for the load had been processed. It hadn't. The balance was the same as it had been yesterday. He refreshed the app and checked again. Still nothing. A cold realization settled over him. He wasn't going to get paid for this load. The whole thing had been a setup, designed to move illegal cargo using an unknowing driver who could be blamed if anything went wrong. He thought about Lucian's list of abandoned trucks, the drivers who'd vanished without a trace. He thought about the voice on the CB warning him not to open the trailer, not to talk to anyone, not to deviate from the route. And he realized that the only reason he was still alive and free was because he'd done exactly what they wanted. He'd picked up the load, driven the route, delivered the cargo, and signed the paperwork. He'd made himself useful. But now that the delivery was complete, he was a liability, a witness, someone who knew too much and had documentation to prove it. He needed to get out of New Mexico fast, before whoever was running this operation decided he was more trouble than he was worth. He shifted the Kenworth into gear and pulled out of the lot, heading back toward I-40. But instead of continuing east toward Tucumcari, he took the westbound on-ramp, heading back the way he'd come. If they were tracking the trailer, they'd know he'd gone the wrong direction. But the trailer was empty now, and he didn't care. He needed distance and time to figure out his next move. He drove west for 30 miles, scanning the mirrors for any sign of pursuit, then took an exit into a small town called Moriarty and pulled into a truck stop. He parked in the back corner of the lot, away from the fuel pumps and the other trucks, and killed the engine. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and started searching for information about the industrial complex at exit 333. He found nothing. No business listings, no property records, no mention of Facility 333 anywhere online. It was a ghost location, operating off the grid. He tried searching for the brokerage firm that had hired him for the load, and found only a basic website with no contact information beyond a generic email address. No physical address, no staff directory, no history. A shell company, probably created just for this operation. He opened his photos and looked at the images he'd taken, the revised bill of lading, the warehouse, the unmarked crates. It was evidence, but evidence of what? Without knowing what was in the crates, he couldn't prove anything illegal had happened. And if he went to the police, they'd want to know why he'd driven off route, why he'd delivered to an unauthorized location, why he'd signed paperwork acknowledging the delivery. He'd look complicit, maybe even guilty. He was about to put the phone away when it buzzed with a new text message. Unknown number again. The message was short. You went west. Wrong choice. Turn around. Boaz stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. They were still tracking him. Even with the trailer empty, even this far from the delivery site, they knew exactly where he was. He looked out the window at the empty parking lot, the dark shapes of other trucks scattered across the pavement, the distant glow of the truck stop's fluorescent lights. Was someone out there watching him right now? He grabbed his tire iron and climbed down from the cab, walking quickly toward the truck stop building. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A clerk behind the counter, a couple of drivers eating at the diner, a janitor mopping the floor. Boaz went to the restroom and splashed cold water on his face, trying to calm down and think clearly. He couldn't keep running. Eventually, he'd run out of fuel or money, or both, and they'd find him. His only option was to go to the authorities with what he knew and hope they'd protect him long enough to make a case. But who could he trust? Local police might be on the take, and federal agencies would want concrete proof before they'd act. He dried his face and walked back outside, heading toward his truck. That's when he saw the vehicle parked next to his Kenworth, a dark SUV with tinted windows, engine running. The same kind of vehicle that had chased him on the old Route 66. Boaz froze, his hand tightening on the tire iron. The driver's door of the SUV opened and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black jacket and jeans. He didn't look threatening, didn't make any aggressive moves, just stood there with his hands visible. "Boaz Whitlock," the man called out. Boaz didn't answer. The man walked closer, stopping about 10 feet away. "My name's Lucian Baird. We met earlier tonight, out on the old highway. I need to talk to you." Boaz squinted at him in the dim light. It was the same man, the retired highway inspector who'd flagged him down at mile 267. "How did you find me?" Boaz asked. "Same way they did," Lucian said, gesturing toward Boaz's phone. "You've been calling numbers, searching online, leaving a digital trail. I've been monitoring the operations communications network for years. When I saw you break pattern and head west instead of continuing to Tucumcari, I knew you were in trouble." "You said I should deliver the load and never come back," Boaz said. "Why are you here now?" "Because things have changed," Lucian said. "The cargo you delivered tonight wasn't just drugs or weapons. It was something bigger, something the feds have been trying to track for months. And you just became the only witness who can connect that cargo to the facility at exit 3D3, which means you're in more danger now than you were before." Boaz felt his stomach twist. What was in those crates? Lucian looked around the parking lot, checking for anyone watching, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Stolen military hardware, night vision equipment, encrypted communications gear, possibly explosives. The kind of stuff that gets sold to foreign buyers or domestic extremist groups. The people running this operation have been moving it through the old Route 66 corridor for years, using unknowing drivers like you to transport it without attracting attention. But tonight's delivery was supposed to be the last one before they shut down the route and moved the operation somewhere else. You were supposed to be a loose end that got tied up quietly." "So why am I still alive?" Boaz asked. "Because killing a driver on the side of the road attracts attention," Lucian said. "They prefer to make it look like accidents, brake failures, jackknifed trailers, drivers who fall asleep and go off the road. It takes time to set up. Time you don't have unless you disappear right now." "Where am I supposed to go?" Boaz asked. "Anywhere but here," Lucian said. "Ditch the truck, take your personal vehicle if you have one, and get as far from New Mexico as you can. I can give you contact information for a federal agent who's been investigating this operation. She's clean, and she'll protect you if you agree to testify, but you have to move now. They're already looking for you, and it won't take them long to figure out where you stopped." Boaz looked at his Kenworth, then back at Lucian. "I can't just abandon my truck. That's my livelihood." "Your truck or your life," Lucian said flatly. "Choose." Boaz stood there in the cold night air, weighing the impossible decision, knowing that either way, nothing would ever be the same. Boaz stood in that truck stop parking lot for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, looking between Lucian and his Kenworth. The truck represented everything he'd worked for over the last 15 years. His independence, his income, his entire adult life reduced to 18 wheels and a diesel engine. Walking away from it felt like surrendering, like admitting defeat. But Lucian's expression left no room for argument. This wasn't a negotiation. It was survival. "I need to grab my things," Boaz said finally. 5 minutes, Lucian said. "That's all you get. They're monitoring the truck stop cameras by now. They know you're here, and they're trying to figure out if you're alone or if you're talking to someone. Every second you stay makes it worse." Boaz nodded and walked quickly to his Kenworth, climbing into the cab one last time. He grabbed his duffel bag from behind the seat and started stuffing it with essentials: wallet, phone charger, his logbook, a change of clothes. He hesitated over the CB radio handset, then unclipped it and shoved it in the bag too. Evidence, maybe, if he ever got the chance to tell someone what had happened. He climbed down and locked the cab, then stood there with his hand on the door handle, looking at the trailer one last time. Empty now, but still carrying the weight of what it had transported. He thought about taking photos of the truck and trailer numbers, documenting everything before he walked away. But Lucian was already gesturing urgently from beside the SUV. Time was up. Boaz walked over and threw his duffel into the back seat, then climbed into the passenger side. Lucian pulled out of the parking lot immediately, heading south on a service road that paralleled the interstate. "Where are we going?" Boaz asked. "Albuquerque," Lucian said. "There's a federal building there with agents who've been investigating this operation. I've been feeding them information for months, but they've never had a witness who could testify about the delivery process. You're the first driver who got away with enough evidence to make a case." "What evidence?" Boaz said. "I signed paperwork saying I delivered to Facility 33. That makes me complicit." "It makes you a witness," Lucian corrected. "You didn't know what you were transporting, and you can testify about how the operation works, the route, the tracking, the diversion to an unauthorized facility. That's more than the feds have had to work with before." Boaz looked out the window at the dark desert rushing past. "What about Cormac? The tow truck driver, is he part of this?" "Probably," Lucian said. "But he's small-time, a contractor who gets paid to escort loads and make sure drivers don't deviate from the route. He might not even know what's being transported. The real players are the ones coordinating the logistics, the dispatchers, the warehouse operators, whoever's buying the stolen military hardware. Cormac's just a tool." "And the voice on the CB?" Boaz asked. "The one who warned me not to stop?" Lucian was quiet for a moment. "That might have been me," he said finally. "I monitor the CB frequencies out on the old Route 66. When I saw you stopping at that abandoned Peterbilt, I tried to warn you off before you got too involved. Didn't work." Boaz felt a chill. "You've been watching this whole time?" "Not watching," Lucian said. "Documenting. There's a difference. I don't have the resources to stop what's happening out there. All I can do is record it and hope that eventually someone with authority will care enough to act." They drove in silence for another 20 miles. Then Lucian's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it, and his jaw tightened. "What?" Boaz asked. "They found your truck," Lucian said. "There's a message on one of the encrypted channels I've been monitoring. They're sending someone to the truck stop right now to check if you're still there. And when they find out I'm not, then they'll start looking for you," Lucian said. "Which is why we need to get you to the federal building as fast as possible. Once you're inside and under protection, they can't touch you without exposing themselves." He accelerated, pushing the SUV up to 80 on the empty highway. Boaz gripped the door handle and tried to steady his breathing. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see another text from the unknown number. "Last chance. Return to your truck. Drive to Tucumcari. We'll forget this happened." He showed the message to Lucian. "They're offering me a way out," Boaz said. "They're lying," Lucian said flatly. "They just want to know if you're still responding to messages. Don't reply. Turn off your phone and remove the battery if you can." Boaz powered down his phone and pulled off the back panel, removing the battery. The screen went dark. "How did you know they'd come after me?" he asked. Because this isn't the first time, Lucian said. I've seen this pattern before. A driver gets hired for a priority load, gets routed through the old highway, delivers to an unauthorized location. Most of them don't ask questions. They just take their money and move on. But every so often, there's someone like you. Someone who notices things, who tries to verify what they're hauling, who doesn't just blindly follow orders. Those drivers become problems, and problems get eliminated. How many? Boaz asked. How many drivers have been eliminated? Lucian's expression darkened. 15 that I know of. Maybe more. They don't always do it right away. Sometimes they wait weeks or months, then stage an accident when the driver's on another route somewhere far from New Mexico. Brake line cut, tire blowout, trailer comes loose on a mountain pass. The investigation calls it driver error or mechanical failure, and the case gets closed. Boaz felt his mouth go dry. So even if I testify, even if the feds arrest the people running this operation, I'm still a target. Yes, Lucian said, which is why witness protection is part of the deal. New identity, new location, new life. It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternative. They reached the outskirts of Albuquerque just after 3 a.m., and Lucian took a circuitous route through residential neighborhoods before finally pulling up to a nondescript office building downtown. It was 4 stories, concrete and glass, with no signage indicating what agencies operated inside. Lucian parked in a loading zone and killed the engine. This is it, he said. Federal building. DEA and ATF have offices on the 3rd floor. The agent you need to talk to is named... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something in the rearview mirror. Boaz turned and saw a vehicle pulling into the lot behind them, a dark sedan with tinted windows moving slowly. Is that them? Boaz asked. I don't know, Lucian said, but we're not waiting to find out. Get inside, now. He opened his door, and Boaz did the same, grabbing his duffel and running toward the building entrance. The lobby was lit but empty, the security desk unmanned at this hour. Lucian led him to an elevator and jabbed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors closed just as the sedan pulled up outside, and Boaz caught a glimpse of 2 men getting out before the elevator started rising. The 3rd floor hallway was fluorescent bright and institutional, lined with office doors marked with agency seals. Lucian walked quickly to a door at the end marked ATF, Field Operations, and pounded on it. No response. He tried the handle. Locked. Damn it, Lucian muttered. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, groggy and irritated. This is Special Agent Carver. Who is this, and why are you calling at 3 a.m? It's Lucian Baird, Lucian said. I've got the witness I told you about. The driver who delivered to Facility 333 tonight. We're outside your office right now and we need protection. They're following us. There was a pause, then the sound of movement on the other end. I'm 10 minutes away. Don't leave the building. I'll call building security and have them meet you in the lobby. There might not be 10 minutes, Lucian said, but the call had already ended. He looked at Boaz. We go back downstairs and wait in the lobby. Stay visible, stay near the doors. They won't try anything where there are cameras. They took the elevator back down, and as the doors opened, Boaz saw the 2 men from the sedan standing in the lobby, looking around. They were both dressed in casual clothes, jeans, jackets, baseball caps pulled low. One of them spotted Boaz and Lucian and started walking toward them. Boaz Whitlock? The man called out. His voice was calm, almost friendly. Boaz didn't respond. Lucian stepped in front of him, blocking the man's path. Federal agents are on their way, Lucian said. You need to leave. The man smiled thinly. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk to Mr. Whitlock about the delivery he made tonight. Clear up some confusion about the paperwork." "There's no confusion," Lucien said. "He delivered the load where he was told to deliver it. That's all he knows." The second man had circled around and was now standing between them and the exit. "Maybe we should all step outside and discuss this privately," he said. His hand was resting on something under his jacket, not drawn, but ready. Boaz felt his pulse hammering in his ears. They were trapped. The lobby had cameras, but that wouldn't stop these men if they decided to escalate. He looked at Lucien, who was slowly reaching into his own jacket, and realized this was about to turn violent. Then the building's front doors opened, and a woman strode in, late 30s, athletic build, wearing a windbreaker with ATF stenciled across the back. She had a badge clipped to her belt and her hand on her holstered sidearm. She looked at the two men flanking Boaz and Lucien, then at Boaz himself. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "I'm Special Agent Carver. You're under federal protection as of right now. These men need to leave the building immediately or they'll be arrested for obstruction." The first man held up his hands in a placating gesture. "We're just trying to resolve a delivery issue." "Out," Agent Carver said. "Now." The two men looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them, then turned and walked toward the exit. The second man paused at the door and looked back at Boaz. "We know where your truck is," he said quietly. "We know where your family is. Think about that before you say anything stupid." Then they were gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Agent Carver watched them through the glass doors for a moment, then turned to Boaz and Lucien. "Upstairs," she said. "We have a lot to talk about." The next 6 hours were a blur. Agent Carver took Boaz's statement in a secure interview room, recording everything he said about the load, the route, the diversion to Facility 333, the cargo he'd seen being unloaded. She asked about Cormac, about the voice on the CB, about the text messages and the GPS tracker. Boaz told her everything, holding nothing back. When he was done, she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "This corroborates what Lucien's been telling us for months," she said. "But it's still not enough for warrants. We need physical evidence, the cargo itself, or documentation that links specific individuals to the facility. What you've given us is testimony, which is valuable, but it won't hold up in court without corroboration." "What about the tracker on my trailer?" Boaz asked. "Can't you use that to prove they were monitoring me?" "The tracker's probably been removed by now," Agent Carver said. "And even if we recovered it, it doesn't prove criminal intent. They could claim it was a standard security measure for high-value freight. We need more." Boaz felt exhaustion and frustration washing over him in equal measure. "So what do I do now? Just sit here while they figure out how to kill me?" "You enter witness protection," Agent Carver said. "We relocate you, give you a new identity, set you up somewhere far from here. You stay off the grid until we can build a case strong enough to prosecute. It might take months, maybe years, but it's the only way to keep you safe." "And my truck?" Boaz asked. "My livelihood?" "Gone," Agent Carver said bluntly. "You can't go back to trucking, not under your real name. That's the trade-off, your life in exchange for your old life." Boaz sat there in the sterile interview room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, and felt the weight of what he was losing settle over him like a physical thing. His truck, his roots, his independence, all of it gone because he'd taken one job from the wrong broker. He thought about the 15 other drivers Lucien had mentioned, the ones who'd disappeared over the years. How many of them had sat in rooms like this, making the same impossible choice? "What if I don't want protection?" Boaz asked. "What if I just want to walk away and forget this happened?" Agent Carver looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Then you'll be dead within a week. These people don't forgive witnesses, Mr. Whitlock. They don't take chances. You've seen too much and you know too much. The only question is whether you disappear on your terms or theirs." Boaz closed his eyes and thought about the broken mile markers scattered across the old Route 66, silent monuments to a highway that nobody remembered. He thought about the drivers who'd come before him, who'd made deliveries they didn't understand and paid for it with their lives. And he thought about the voice on the CB that had warned him to keep moving, to not stop, to not look too closely at what he was hauling. That voice had been Lucian, trying to save him from a fate he hadn't seen coming. "Okay," Boaz said finally. "I'll do it. I'll take the protection." Agent Carver nodded and stood up. "We'll start the process today. You'll be moved to a safe house while we arrange your relocation. In the meantime, don't contact anyone from your old life. No family, no friends, no former employers. From this point forward, Boaz Whitlock doesn't exist." 3 days later, Boaz sat in a generic motel room somewhere in the Midwest, looking at the paperwork spread across the bed. A new driver's license with a name he didn't recognize, a new social security number, a bank account with enough money to get started but not enough to last long. Agent Carver had told him he'd need to find work under his new identity, something that didn't involve trucking or anything else that might draw attention. He was supposed to be invisible now, a ghost passing through a world that had already forgotten him. His phone, a new one, clean and untraceable, buzzed with a message from Lucian. "They raided Facility 333 last night. Found evidence of the military hardware shipments. Arrests coming soon. You did the right thing." Boaz read the message twice, then deleted it. Doing the right thing was supposed to feel satisfying, redemptive, like justice had been served. But all he felt was empty. He thought about his Kenworth sitting abandoned in that truck stop parking lot, probably already impounded or sold at auction. He thought about the routes he'd driven for years, the landscapes he'd memorized, the truck stops where everyone knew his name. All of it was gone now, erased like the mile markers on the old highway. He walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, watching the other travelers come and go. Families loading luggage into minivans, business people checking their phones, truckers pulling in for the night. Normal people living normal lives, unaware of the networks of crime and violence running beneath the surface of everything they took for granted. Boaz had been one of them once. Now he was something else, a witness, a liability, a name that didn't exist attached to a face that had to stay hidden. The motel TV was on with the sound muted, showing a news report about a federal raid on an illegal arms trafficking operation in New Mexico. Boaz watched as the footage showed agents leading suspects in handcuffs out of a warehouse. The location identified as an undisclosed facility near Interstate 40. He recognized the building, Facility 333, the place where he'd delivered the load that had destroyed his life. The news anchor was calling it a major victory in the fight against domestic terrorism. They didn't mention the drivers who'd been used as unwitting couriers. They didn't mention the abandoned highway or the broken mile markers or the people who'd disappeared trying to do the right thing. Boaz turned off the TV and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He'd survived, which was more than 15 other drivers could say. But survival had come at a cost he was only beginning to understand. He'd lost his name, his profession, his entire identity. He was alive, but only technically. The person he'd been, Boaz Whitlock, independent trucker, driver of Western routes, was dead. And in his place was someone new, someone unnamed and undefined, drifting through a life that felt borrowed and temporary. His phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number, and for a second his blood ran cold, thinking it was them, the people from the operation, tracking him down despite the protection. But when he opened it, the message was short and unsigned. They're still moving freight through the old highways. Different routes now, different drivers. Same operation. It never stops. Stay safe. Lucian. Still out there, still documenting, still trying to expose something that nobody seemed able or willing to stop. Boaz deleted the message and powered off the phone. He couldn't think about the operation anymore. He couldn't think about the drivers who were probably hauling illegal cargo right now, unknowing and vulnerable, following GPS routes that led them into traps they wouldn't understand until it was too late. He couldn't save them. He could barely save himself. He lay back on the motel bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of trucks on the nearby interstate, the low rumble of diesel engines, the hiss of air brakes, the endless rhythm of freight moving across the country. It was a sound he'd lived with for 15 years, a sound that used to mean freedom and independence. Now it just sounded like a warning. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but all he could see were the broken mile markers stretching into the darkness, the road ahead unmarked and unmeasured, leading nowhere he wanted to go. Somewhere out there, on the old highways that nobody remembered, trucks were still moving through the night, carrying cargo they didn't understand, driven by people who didn't know they were already dead, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Nothing except survive, and hope that somehow, someday, survival would be enough. Lyle Pendry had been driving the Nevada corridors long enough to know that U.S. Route 50 earned its nickname honestly. They called it the loneliest road in America, and for good reason. 300 miles of empty desert stretched between Ely and Fallon, with nothing but sagebrush, alkali flats, and the occasional ghost town marking the distance. Most truckers avoided it entirely, preferring I-80 to the north where there were services and civilization. But Lyle didn't mind the isolation. He'd been hauling refrigerated freight across the western states for 12 years, and the quiet stretches gave him time to think, time to decompress from the chaos of loading docks and way stations. This run was supposed to be straightforward. A load of frozen food products from Salt Lake City to Reno, following US 50 west through the heart of Nevada. The dispatcher had warned him about weather moving in from the northwest, a late-season storm system that might drop snow in the higher elevations, but the forecast showed it wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon. Plenty of time to cross the desert and reach Reno before the roads got bad. He'd left Salt Lake at dawn and made good time through Utah, crossing into Nevada just after noon. The landscape changed immediately. The green valleys and pine forests giving way to high desert plateau, the mountains retreating to distant purple ridges on the horizon. The road stretched ahead in a perfect straight line for miles at a time. The white center line and the black asphalt, the only contrast against the brown and gray emptiness. Lyle kept his Freightliner at 65 and watched the fuel gauge, which showed 3/4 full. He topped off in Ely, which should give him enough to reach Fallon without another stop. The reefer unit on his trailer hummed steadily, keeping the load at -10 degrees, and the temperature gauge on his dashboard showed everything running normal. He picked up the CB handset out of habit and scanned through the channels, but there was only static. No other trucks, no chatter, nothing. Just him and the empty road. Around mile marker 150, the sky started to change. What had been clear blue all morning was now streaked with high cirrus clouds, thin and wispy, moving fast from the northwest. Lyle checked his weather app and frowned. The storm system had accelerated, now predicted to arrive by early evening instead of tomorrow. He was still 100 miles from Fallon, which meant 2 more hours of driving if conditions stayed good, But if the storm hit early and brought snow, he might be looking at 3 or 4 hours, maybe more. He thought about pulling off at the next town and waiting out the weather. But the next town was Austin, population 200, with 1 gas station and no truck services. If he was going to stop anywhere, it made more sense to push through to Fallon, where there were proper facilities. He accelerated slightly, bringing his speed up to 70, and focused on making time while the road was still clear. By mile marker 170, the wind had picked up. Lyle could feel it buffeting the trailer, the gusts strong enough to push the entire rig sideways by inches. He eased off the throttle and gripped the wheel tighter, watching the center line to make sure he stayed in his lane. The sky ahead was darker now, the clouds thickening and lowering, and he could see curtains of precipitation in the distance. Snow, probably, or freezing rain. His phone buzzed with a notification. Winter Weather Advisory. Heavy snow expected along US 50 corridor. Travel not recommended after 6 p.m. He checked the time. It was 3:30. 2.5 hours until the advisory went into effect, and he still had 90 miles to go. He could make it if he kept moving, but it would be close. Then, at mile marker 185, the road ahead disappeared into white. Not snow. Fog. Dense and sudden, rolling across the highway like a physical wall. Lyle hit his hazard lights and slowed to 40, then 30, his visibility dropping to less than 50 feet. The fog was cold and wet, condensing on his windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. He turned on his fog lamps and leaned forward, squinting through the glass, trying to follow the road markers on the shoulder. The center line had vanished completely, swallowed by the white void. He'd driven through fog before, but this was different. Thicker, more disorienting, with strange eddies and currents that made it hard to judge distance or direction. His GPS showed he was still on US 50, but the map display kept flickering and losing signal, the blue route line disappearing for seconds at a time before reappearing in slightly different positions. He slowed to 20 miles per hour and kept his eyes on the shoulder reflectors, using them to navigate. Then the reflectors stopped. Lyle tapped his brakes and brought the Freightliner to a crawl, looking for the next marker. Nothing. Just empty pavement and swirling fog. He checked the GPS again. The screen was frozen, showing his position at mile marker 185, even though he'd been driving for at least another mile since then. He tried refreshing the app, but it wouldn't load. No signal. He was reaching for the CB radio when his headlights caught something on the right side of the road. A structure, low and rectangular with a peaked roof. A building. Lyle eased the truck to a stop and stared at it through the fog. It looked like a rest area, one of the old state-built facilities from the 60s or 70s with a small parking lot and what might be restrooms. But there were no lights, no signs, and the GPS didn't show any rest areas in this section of highway. He put the truck in park and climbed down, grabbing his flashlight. The cold hit him immediately. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since he'd entered the fog, and the wind carried tiny ice crystals that stung his face. He walked toward the building, his boots crunching on gravel and broken asphalt. As he got closer, he could see that the rest area was abandoned. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The painted lines faded to almost nothing. The building itself was boarded up, the windows covered with plywood, the doors chained shut. A sign near the entrance, barely legible, read, US 50 Rest Area, closed 1998, no services, 27 years abandoned. But something about the place felt wrong. The boards over the windows were too new, the chains on the doors too clean, and there was a vehicle parked behind the building, a white van, no markings, with Nevada plates. Lyle walked around the side of the building, his flashlight sweeping across the gravel. The van's rear doors were closed, but there were fresh tire tracks leading away from it, heading toward a service road that branched off from the rest area and disappeared into the fog. He tried the van's doors, locked. He peered through the tinted windows but couldn't see anything inside. He was about to head back to his truck when he noticed something on the ground near the van's rear bumper, a shipping label, torn and muddy, but still partially readable. It showed a barcode, a tracking number, and a destination address in Reno, the same city where Lyle's load was headed. He picked up the label and examined it under his flashlight. The tracking number matched the format his company used, and the barcode was from a legitimate freight carrier. But the destination address wasn't a warehouse or distribution center. It was a P.O. box. He folded the label and put it in his pocket, then walked back to his truck. Something was happening at this abandoned rest area, something recent and ongoing, and whatever it was, it involved freight shipments to Reno. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, intending to get back on the highway and put distance between himself and this place. But as he shifted into drive, his headlights picked out something new. Tire marks in the gravel, leading from the parking lot back onto US 50, heading west. Fresh marks, made within the last hour. Someone had been here recently, and they were ahead of him on the road. Lyle drove through the fog for another 10 miles, following the faint tire tracks on the wet pavement when he could see them, navigating by instinct when he couldn't. The visibility hadn't improved. If anything, it had gotten worse. The fog now mixed with sleet that rattled against his windshield and turned the road surface slick. His speed had dropped to 15 miles per hour, and the reefer unit on his trailer was working overtime to maintain temperature in the deteriorating conditions. He kept checking his mirrors for headlights behind him, but there was only white emptiness. Whoever had left those tire tracks at the rest area was still somewhere ahead, invisible in the storm. Around what he estimated was mile marker 195, though his GPS was still frozen, he saw brake lights materialize out of the fog, 2 red dots hanging in the white void. He eased off the throttle and brought the Freightliner to a stop about 50 feet back, leaving his hazards on. The vehicle ahead wasn't moving. Lyle grabbed his flashlight and climbed down again, the cold even more brutal now, the wind driving sleet horizontally across the highway. He walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the ice-covered asphalt. The vehicle was a highway patrol cruiser, parked at an angle across the right lane with its light bar dark. The driver's door was open and the engine was running, exhaust steaming in the frozen air. Lyle approached cautiously and called out, "Highway Patrol, you need assistance?" No response. He reached the door and shined his flashlight inside. The cab was empty, but the heater was on full blast and a clipboard sat on the passenger seat with paperwork still clipped to it. He picked it up and saw it was a vehicle inspection form, partially filled out, dated today. The officer's name was printed at the top. Sergeant Orrin Talmadge. The inspection form listed a vehicle description: white van, no plates, commercial cargo area, and a location: US 50 rest area MM 185. The same rest area Lyle had just left. The same white van he'd seen parked behind the building. Talmadge had been there, had documented the van, and then had driven west on US 50. But now his cruiser was abandoned on the highway with the engine running and no sign of the officer. Lyle looked around, sweeping his flashlight across the fog-shrouded landscape. The desert on either side of the highway was flat and featureless, offering no place to hide or take shelter. There were no buildings, no vehicles, nothing that would explain where Talmadge had gone. Then Lyle noticed something on the pavement near the cruiser's rear bumper. Boot prints, leading away from the vehicle and off the shoulder into the desert. He followed them with his flashlight beam for about 30 feet before they disappeared into a shallow wash. Lyle walked to the edge of the wash and looked down. The bottom was filled with running water, maybe 6 inches deep, flowing fast from the storm runoff. and lying half-submerged in the water was something dark and rectangular, a case or a box. Lyle climbed down carefully, his boots slipping on the wet rocks, and retrieved it. It was a hard shell case, black plastic, latched but not locked. He carried it back up to the highway and set it on the hood of the patrol cruiser, then opened it. Inside were documents, dozens of them, organized in clear plastic sleeves. Shipping manifests, weigh station records, cargo inspection reports. All of them dated within the last 6 months, and all of them related to freight moving through the US 50 corridor. Lyle pulled out one of the manifests and examined it under his flashlight. It listed a shipment of electronic components being transported from Salt Lake City to Reno, following the same route he was driving now. But the manifest had been marked with a red stamp. Failed inspection. Discrepancy in declared weight. Similar stamps appeared on most of the other documents in the case. Lyle's hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. Talmadge had been investigating freight shipments on this route, documenting weight discrepancies and inspection failures, and judging by the number of documents in the case, this had been going on for months. Lyle thought about his own load: frozen food products, legal and documented, with proper bills of lading and weigh station receipts. Or, at least, that's what his dispatcher had told him. He'd never actually verified the weight himself, had just trusted the paperwork. He was about to close the case when he noticed a handwritten note tucked into one of the sleeves. Dead beacon at MM 200. Multiple vehicles using location as transfer point. Investigate further. MM 200. Mile marker 200. About 5 miles ahead of where he was now, and the note mentioned a dead beacon, probably a weigh station or inspection point that had been decommissioned. Lyle looked at the patrol cruiser, then at the tire tracks disappearing into the fog ahead. Talmadge had been heading west toward mile marker 200 when something made him stop here. Either he'd found evidence that required immediate documentation, or he'd encountered something, or someone, that prevented him from continuing. Either way, the officer was gone now, and Lyle was alone on an empty highway with a case full of evidence suggesting organized freight smuggling. He climbed back into his Freightliner and set the case on the passenger seat, his mind racing. The smart thing to do was turn around, drive back to Ely, and report everything to the authorities. But turning around meant backing his rig through several miles of fog and sleet on a narrow highway with no shoulder, which was dangerous and maybe impossible. The other option was to keep going west, try to reach Fallon, or at least find a place with cell service where he could call for help. But that meant driving past mile marker 200, past the dead beacon that Talmadge had been investigating. He thought about the white van at the rest area, the fresh tire tracks, the shipping label with the Reno P.O. box address. Someone was moving freight through this corridor using abandoned facilities as transfer points, manipulating weight records to avoid inspection. And Talmadge had gotten too close to exposing them. Lyle shifted into gear and started driving, following the tire tracks west. He had to know what was at mile marker 200. Had to understand what he'd gotten himself involved in. The fog began to thin slightly as he approached what he estimated was mile marker 198, enough that he could see about 100 feet ahead. His GPS flickered back to life for a few seconds, confirming his position, then died again. The sleet had turned to light snow, fat flakes swirling in his headlights. Then he saw it. A structure on the right side of the highway, larger than the rest area, with a covered scale platform and a small building. A weigh station. But like the rest area, it was abandoned. The scale was rusted and partially collapsed, the building's windows shattered, and there were no lights or power. A faded sign near the entrance read, Nevada Dot, Weigh Station Closed, 2003. But there was activity here. Fresh tire tracks crisscrossed the parking area, and there were vehicles parked behind the building. two white vans, and a semi-truck with its trailer doors open. Work lights had been set up on portable stands, illuminating the area in harsh white light. And there were people, 4 or 5 of them, moving between the vehicles and carrying boxes. Lyle pulled off onto the shoulder about 200 feet before the way station and killed his lights. He grabbed his phone, still no signal, and the case Talmadge had been carrying, then climbed down from the cab. He moved along the shoulder, using the fog as cover, until he reached the edge of the way station property. From this angle, he could see what was happening more clearly. The semi-truck's trailer was being unloaded, boxes and crates transferred to the 2 vans. The operation was efficient and organized, suggesting this wasn't the first time they'd used this location. Lyle pulled out his phone and started recording video, zooming in on the license plates and the faces of the people working. One of them stood out. A woman, older, maybe 60, wearing a custodian's uniform with a name tag. He couldn't read the tag from this distance, but something about her presence felt wrong. She wasn't loading boxes or supervising the transfer. She was just standing near the way station building, watching the highway like she was acting as a lookout. Then she turned and looked directly at where Lyle was crouching, and he realized with a jolt of fear that she'd seen him. The woman raised her hand and pointed, and the others stopped working and looked in his direction. Lyle didn't wait. He turned and ran back toward his truck, his boots slipping on the icy pavement. Behind him, he heard shouting and the sound of engines starting. He reached the Freightliner and climbed in, throwing the case onto the passenger seat and starting the engine. The headlights of the vans swung toward him as they pulled out of the way station, accelerating fast. Lyle shifted into gear and hit the throttle, the Freightliner lurching forward into the fog. Lyle pushed the Freightliner as hard as he dared through the fog and snow, the speedometer climbing to 45, then 50. The vans behind him matched his speed, their headlights bright in his mirrors, staying close but not attempting to pass or force him off the road. They were herding him, keeping him moving west, and Lyle realized with growing dread that they weren't trying to stop him. They were driving him toward something. He grabbed the CB handset and tried every channel, calling for help, identifying his location as best he could. All he got back was static and interference, like something was blocking the signal. His phone still showed no service. He was cut off, alone, with 2 vehicles pursuing him and no way to call for help. The GPS flickered back on for a moment, showing his position at mile marker 210, then died again. 10 miles past the way station, 30 miles from Fallon. If he could just maintain this speed and keep ahead of them, he might reach civilization before they made their move. But the fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should, the needle sitting just above a quarter tank. The combination of heavy acceleration and the reefer unit running in cold weather was burning diesel at an unsustainable rate. Then the vans fell back, their headlights receding in his mirrors until they disappeared into the fog. Lyle didn't slow down. If anything, he accelerated, pushing the Freightliner up to 60, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The absence of pursuit was almost worse than being chased. It meant they'd accomplished whatever they needed to, or they knew something he didn't about what was waiting ahead. Mile marker 215 flashed past, then 220. The fog was lifting slightly, the visibility improving to maybe 200 feet. Lyle could see the road curving ahead, following the contour of a low ridge, and then, on the right side of the highway, he saw lights. A rest area, this one with functioning lamps illuminating a parking lot and a modern-looking building. A legitimate facility, still in operation. He took the exit without hesitation and pulled into the lot, bringing the Freightliner to a stop near the building entrance. The parking area was empty except for one vehicle, a maintenance truck with Nevada DOT markings. Lyle climbed down and ran toward the building, Talmadge's evidence case clutched under his arm. The rest area's main door was unlocked, and he pushed through into a well-lit lobby with restrooms on one side and vending machines on the other. The place looked clean and maintained, but there was no one at the information desk. He called out, "Hello? Anyone here? I need help. I'm being followed." Footsteps echoed from the hallway leading to the back offices, and a woman appeared. She was in her 60s, wearing a blue custodian's uniform with a name tag that read, Vera Larkspur, the same woman he'd seen at the way station. Lyle froze, his hand tightening on the case. Vera smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Pendry," she said calmly, "we've been expecting you." "How do you know my name?" Lyle asked, backing toward the door. "Because we know everything that moves through this corridor," Vera said. "Every truck, every load, every driver. We've been tracking you since you left Salt Lake City this morning, and we've been very patient, waiting for you to lead us to Sergeant Talmadge's evidence." She gestured toward the case under his arm. "That's what you found in his cruiser, isn't it? The documents he's been collecting for months." Lyle looked at the door behind him, calculating whether he could make it back to his truck before she stopped him. But then he heard engines outside, the two vans, pulling into the parking lot, blocking his Freightliner. He was trapped. "What did you do to Talmadge?" Lyle asked. "Nothing permanent," Vera said. "He's alive, just detained somewhere he can't interfere with our operations. We don't kill law enforcement unless absolutely necessary. Too much attention, too many questions. But civilians are different. Truck drivers disappear on these roads all the time. Accidents, breakdowns, exposure. Nobody thinks twice about it." She walked closer, her hand reaching for the case. "Give me the evidence, Mr. Pendry. You hand it over, you drive away, and we forget this ever happened. You try to keep it, and you'll be the fourth driver this year who vanished on US 50. Your choice." Lyle pulled the case closer to his chest. "What's in my trailer? What am I really hauling?" Vera's expression didn't change. "Exactly what your paperwork says. Frozen food products, legal, documented, clean, but the weight is wrong. Your load is 10,000 pounds heavier than the manifest claims, and that extra weight is valuable cargo we can't move through normal channels." "Drugs?" Lyle asked. "Not exactly," Vera said. "Rare earth minerals, stolen from mining operations in Utah, being smuggled to buyers in California who don't ask questions about provenance. The minerals get mixed into your legitimate loads, hidden under the frozen goods, and moved through the corridor without inspection because the old way stations are closed and the new ones are too far apart. We've been doing it for 5 years, moving millions of dollars in stolen materials right under the state's nose. And it works because drivers like you don't know what you're carrying." She held out her hand. "Now give me the case." Lyle looked at the evidence in his arms, then at Vera, then at the door. He thought about Talmadge, detained somewhere, unable to stop what was happening. He thought about the 15 other trucks Vera's operation had probably been using, their drivers all unknowing accomplices in a smuggling ring. And he thought about what would happen if he handed over the evidence. Vera would let him go, and the operation would continue, and nothing would change. But if he refused, he'd end up like the other drivers who'd vanished. Either way, he lost. He made his decision. In one quick motion, he threw the case at Vera's feet, sending documents scattering across the lobby floor, then turned and ran for the door. He heard her shouting behind him, heard footsteps pounding after him, but he didn't look back. He burst out into the cold air and sprinted toward his Freightliner. The vans were parked in front of it, but the men inside were just climbing out, not expecting him to run. Lyle reached his truck and vaulted into the cab, starting the engine and throwing it into reverse. The Freightliner lurched backward, the trailer jackknifing slightly, and he corrected hard, swinging the wheel. The vans tried to reposition to block him, but he was faster, accelerating forward and cutting across the empty parking spaces. He crashed through a low chain barrier at the edge of the lot and bounced back onto the highway, the suspension groaning. In the mirror, he saw the vans scrambling to follow, Vera standing in the rest area entrance, watching. He didn't care about the evidence anymore. He just needed to get away, to reach Fallon, to find someone who would listen. The fog had lifted almost entirely now, and Lyle could see the road ahead stretching clear for miles. He pushed the Freightliner to 70, then 75, the engine straining. The fuel gauge needle was hovering just above empty, the low fuel warning light blinking. He had maybe 10 miles left before the tank ran dry. But Fallon was only 20 miles away. So close. The vans appeared in his mirrors again, gaining fast, and Lyle realized they weren't going to let him reach town. They were going to run him off the road, stage it as an accident, and take whatever was hidden in his trailer. He thought about stopping, surrendering, taking his chances with whatever deal Vera might offer. But he'd already run, already made himself a threat. There was no going back now. The fuel gauge hit empty and the engine started to sputter. Lyle downshifted, trying to squeeze every last mile from the remaining diesel, but the Freightliner was losing power. 60 miles per hour, then 50, then 40. The vans were right behind him now, close enough that he could see the faces of the drivers. And then, ahead on the right, he saw lights. A truck stop, small but legitimate, with a few vehicles parked in the lot. Civilization. Witnesses. He aimed the Freightliner toward it, coasting on momentum, and managed to pull into the lot just as the engine died completely. He grabbed his phone and jumped down, running toward the building. The vans pulled in behind him but didn't follow immediately. Too many people around, too much risk. Lyle burst through the truck stop door and found a clerk behind the counter, a young man staring at him in confusion. "Call the police," Lyle gasped. "Call Highway Patrol. Tell them there's a smuggling operation on US 50 and they're using truckers to move stolen cargo. Tell them Sergeant Talmadge has evidence and he's being detained somewhere near mile marker 200. The clerk blinked. "Are you okay, man? You look—" "Just call them," Lyle shouted. He turned and looked through the window at the parking lot. The vans were still there, idling, waiting. Vera hadn't gotten out. She was just sitting in the passenger seat of one van, watching him through the glass. And then slowly both vans backed up and drove away, disappearing into the night. Lyle stood there, shaking, and realized that she'd let him go. Not out of mercy, but because he'd become more trouble than he was worth. The evidence was destroyed, scattered across that rest area floor. And without it, his testimony was just the word of one panicked truck driver against an operation that had been running successfully for 5 years. The police came an hour later, took his statement, and sent a unit to search for Talmadge's cruiser. They found it right where Lyle had left it, abandoned on the highway. But there was no sign of the sergeant, no case full of documents, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. The way station at mile marker 200 was empty when they checked it. No vehicles, no lights, no trace of the transfer operation Lyle had witnessed. And when they inspected his trailer, they found exactly what the manifest claimed. Frozen food products, properly documented, with the correct weight. No rare earth minerals, no smuggled cargo, nothing illegal. The officer who interviewed him was sympathetic but skeptical, suggesting that the fog and stress had caused Lyle to misinterpret what he'd seen. By the time they released him at dawn, Lyle knew the truth. The operation had cleaned up, erased the evidence, and relocated, and he would never be able to prove what had happened on that lonely stretch of highway. He sat in the truck stop's parking lot as the sun rose, watching the morning traffic build on US 50. Trucks rolling east and west, hauling freight, moving cargo, going about their business. Any one of them could be carrying something hidden, something illegal, and the drivers would never know. Lyle started his Freightliner, The truck stop had given him enough diesel to reach Reno and pulled back onto the highway. He drove west, toward his original destination, but the road felt different now, emptier, more dangerous. And somewhere out in the desert on the loneliest road in America, the dead beacon at mile marker 200 waited in silence, ready for the next load, the next driver, the next delivery that would never be questioned. And Lyle knew he would never drive this route again.